You never truly understand silence until you have spent your first night alone deep in the Appalachian mountain forests. I am telling you this now because what happened to me, what I witnessed, what hunted me through those ancient woods, it all began with that silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums like a physical weight, making your own heartbeat sound like thunder in the hollow of your chest. My name does not matter anymore, but the story does. This happened during my transfer from the relatively tame parks of Montana to the eastern Appalachians in the fall of 2001. I had been a ranger for 8 years by then, confident in my abilities, experienced with lost hikers, illegal campers, and the occasional black bear getting too comfortable around human food. I thought I had seen everything the wilderness could throw at a man. I was catastrophically wrong. The district supervisor, a weathered veteran named Robert Daniels, met me at the ranger station on my first day. The building sat at the end of a winding gravel road, surrounded by ancient oaks and hemlocks that seemed to swallow the autumn sunlight whole. Robert was in his late 50s with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years squinting at horizons and too many nights spent in these woods. He did not smile when he shook my hand. "You read the incident reports I sent?" he asked, his gray eyes searching my face for something I could not identify at the time. "Did you notice how many of those people who were found refused to talk about what actually happened to them out there?" I had noticed. 5 hikers in 3 years, found wandering and traumatized, none willing to speak. The reports listed exposure and disorientation as the cause. But there was something in the way the witnesses had been described, something in the careful clinical language that suggested the investigators themselves had been disturbed by what they had encountered. "People get scared when they are lost," I offered. "Sometimes they do not want to admit how panicked they were." Robert studied me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. It might have been pity. It might have been resignation. "Come inside," he said, turning toward the station door. "There are things you need to know before your first patrol. Things that are not in any manual." Inside, the station had that peculiar smell of old wood and coffee that seems universal to ranger outposts. A large topographical map covered one wall, marked with pins and notations that I would later come to understand represented something far more sinister than trail conditions or wildlife sightings. Robert pointed to a section of dense forest in the northern reaches of the district, an area marked with red pins clustered so tightly they almost overlapped. "This is your primary patrol zone," he said, "about 60 square miles of the oldest forest in the eastern United States. Some of these trees were here before the first European settlers arrived. Some of them were here before the Cherokee walked these ridges. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient, and ancient places have ancient things living in them." He pulled out a file folder thick with papers and handed it to me. The weight of it surprised me. Unusual reports started about 5 years ago. Got more frequent in the last 2 winters. Campers hearing things, seeing things. Hikers who go missing on trails they have walked 100 times before. I opened the folder. The first report was from a camper named Marcus Webb, dated March 1997. His statement described hearing a screaming sound that was not quite human, but not quite animal either, coming from the tree line around 2 in the morning. He had packed up his camp and left at first light, abandoning gear worth several $100s rather than spend another hour in those woods. The investigating ranger had noted that Marcus Webb was a former Marine with 2 combat tours and no history of mental health issues. The next report, from May 1997, came from 2 brothers, Jonathan and Hunter Price. They had been hiking a section of the Appalachian Trail when they found tracks, large barefoot human-like prints that measured nearly 18 inches long. They had taken photos. I examined the grainy images clipped to the report. The prints showed 5 distinct toes pressed deep into the mud near a creek bed, but the proportions were wrong. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and there was something about the depth of the impressions that suggested tremendous weight. "Bigfoot hunters have been coming to Appalachia for decades," I said. These could be hoaxes. Keep reading, Robert replied. The reports got stranger as I worked through the file. A group of college students from Virginia Tech, led by someone named Gabriel Chen, reported seeing a tall figure standing motionless between trees at dusk, watching them from perhaps 50 yards away. They estimated its height at 7 to 8 feet, and all 4 witnesses independently described the same detail. It had been standing perfectly still, but its head had tracked their movement as they passed, turning slowly to follow them like a barn owl watching mice. A hunter named Isaac Morrison claimed something had followed him for 3 hours through the forest on a November afternoon, always staying just out of sight, but breaking branches and making sounds he described as huffing breaths, like a large dog panting after a run, except the rhythm was wrong, too deliberate, too controlled. Isaac had hunted these mountains for 30 years. He never went back after that day. Then I reached the reports from winter 2000, and my skepticism began to crack like ice on a spring pond. Thomas Brennan, an experienced woodsman with 2 decades of backcountry experience, had called 911 from a ridge shelter in January. The dispatch recording was transcribed in the file. His voice shook as he described something circling his position in the darkness, something he could hear but rarely see, something that moved through the winter forest without disturbing the frozen crust of snow that crackled under his own boots. When it finally showed itself at the edge of his firelight, Thomas Brennan, a man who had faced down black bears and once spent 3 days lost in a blizzard without panicking, had barricaded himself inside the shelter and refused to come out until state police arrived at dawn. What did he see? I asked Robert. He would not say. Not exactly. Just kept repeating that it was wrong, that it looked like a person but it moved wrong, stood wrong, watched him wrong. The state police found tracks around the shelter, big tracks, but they could not identify them. Animal control came out and brought a wildlife biologist from the university. No one could explain what had left those prints in the snow. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the station. "There is one more thing you need to see," Robert said. He led me to a back room where evidence from various incidents was stored in metal cabinets and plastic bins. He unlocked one cabinet and pulled out a sealed evidence bag containing what looked like a tuft of coarse hair, dark brown with gray tips. "Found this caught on a tree branch near where Thomas Brennan made his call," Robert explained. "We sent it to the state lab. The DNA came back as primarily human, but with markers they could not identify. The lab tech who processed it called me personally to ask where we had found it. When I told her, she went quiet for a long time and then said she was going to pretend the sample had been contaminated, and the results were inconclusive. I took the bag, examining the hair through the plastic. It was longer than human hair should be, coarser, and there was something about the texture that made my skin crawl. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Robert Daniels looked at me with eyes that had seen too much over too many years in these mountains. "I do not know," he said quietly. "But whatever it is not something that should exist. And it is getting bolder." He assigned me to night patrols starting that very evening. The logic made sense on the surface. Most of the incidents had occurred between dusk and dawn. I would be driving the logging roads, checking campsites, watching for poachers, and keeping an eye out for whatever else might be lurking in the darkness. But I understood the real reason. Robert wanted me to see for myself. He wanted me to understand what we were dealing with before I dismissed it as mountain folklore and superstition. I spent the afternoon familiarizing myself with my patrol area, driving the maze of forest roads in daylight. The woods here were different from Montana, older somehow, darker even under the October sun. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to create tunnels of vegetation that blocked out the sky. Rhododendron thickets formed impenetrable walls on either side of the narrow roads, their glossy leaves catching what little light filtered through the canopy. The hair on the back of my neck stood at rigid attention. "I am armed," I shouted, and this time I could not hide the crack in my voice. "Show yourself or leave the area." The breathing stopped, In the sudden silence, I heard something moving through the underbrush, circling around my position. Not walking, not running, but flowing somehow, moving through the forest with a grace and silence that should have been impossible for anything that large. I spun, trying to keep my light on the movement, but whatever it was stayed just beyond the reach of the beam. I caught glimpses, flickers at the edge of my vision, a shape too large to be human, moving between trees with unsettling fluidity. Then, for just a fraction of a second, my light caught it full on. My brain could not immediately process what I was seeing. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. The body was humanoid in basic shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but every proportion was wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the neck extended in a way that should have been impossible for any mammalian creature. The skin, if you could call it skin, was grayish and rough, like tree bark or dried leather stretched over a frame of bone and sinew. But the face was the worst. It had features that were almost human. A nose, a mouth, 2 eyes, but they were arranged wrong, placed in positions that violated every rule of anatomy and symmetry. The eyes were too far apart and set at slightly different heights. The mouth was too wide and positioned lower than it should have been, near where the throat began. And the nose was barely there, just 2 slits that flared and contracted as the thing breathed. It was looking directly at me. Those mismatched eyes, reflecting my flashlight beam with a dull amber glow, fixed on my position with an intelligence that froze my blood in my veins. This was not an animal. Animals do not look at you like that, do not study you with that kind of calculating awareness. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds. Time had stopped. The universe had contracted to that clearing, to that moment, to the beam of my flashlight and the thing standing in it. Then it moved. Not toward me, thank God, but sideways, stepping behind a tree trunk that was at least 3 feet in diameter. It should not have been able to hide behind that tree. It was too big, too tall. But somehow it folded itself into the shadow and was gone, leaving only the afterimage burned into my retinas and the memory of those misplaced eyes. I stood there with the shotgun raised for a full minute after it had disappeared. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. When I finally lowered the gun, I realized I was breathing in short, rapid gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. I grabbed the camera from the ground and ran. I did not care about procedure anymore. I did not care about investigating the campsite or collecting evidence or filing reports. I needed to get out of these woods. I needed to tell Robert what I had seen. I needed to be somewhere with lights and walls and other human beings. The trail seemed longer on the way back, the darkness more oppressive. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something with amber eyes and too many wrong angles. I could hear things moving in the underbrush around me, keeping pace, watching. When I finally reached my truck, I threw myself inside and locked the doors immediately. My hands fumbled with the keys, dropped them, found them again. The engine roared to life and I floored the accelerator, spraying gravel as I tore down the logging road toward the main highway. The radio crackled to life as I got closer to civilization. Unit 7, this is base. We have been trying to reach you for an hour. What is your status? I keyed the mic and for a moment I did not know what to say. How do you report something like this? How do you describe an encounter with something that should not exist? Base. I found the campsite. It is destroyed. And I stopped, tried to steady my voice. I saw what did it. Say again. Unit 7. I took a deep breath. Robert, there is something in these woods. Something wrong. I saw it. The old stories, whatever you have heard about these mountains, they are true. A long pause, static hissing between us. Get back to base. Now. We need to talk. As I drove through the dark forest, my headlights occasionally catching the reflected eyes of normal animals in the tree line, deer and raccoons, and once a startled fox, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. That somewhere in the darkness behind me, something was keeping pace with my truck, moving through the forest with that impossible fluid grace, watching me with eyes that were set wrong and a face that should not exist. I had been a ranger for 8 years. I had spent countless nights in the wilderness. But that night, my first real night in the Appalachian mountain forests, taught me that I did not know these woods at all. And the woods knew things about fear that I was only beginning to understand. I did not sleep that night. After my return to the ranger station, Robert and I sat in his office until 3 in the morning, going over every report, every incident, every scrap of evidence collected over the past 5 years. The camera I had recovered from the campsite sat on the desk between us, that final image glowing on its cracked screen like an accusation. In 1876, Robert said, pulling out a yellowed newspaper clipping from a file cabinet that looked older than I was, a settler named Elijah Whitmore reported seeing what he called a tall man of the woods near here. The local paper ran his account, mostly as a curiosity. Whitmore described a creature that walked upright like a man but was covered in bark-colored skin and had a face that was, his words, arranged by a god who had forgotten what men should look like. Robert spread more documents across the desk. Historical records, folklore collections, newspaper archives, handwritten accounts from missionaries and settlers dating back to the early 1800s. The Cherokee called them something I cannot pronounce, he continued. The rough translation is those who live between. Between what? No one knows for sure. Between worlds, between forms, between life and death. The stories say they were here before the Cherokee arrived, before any humans walked these mountains. That this land belongs to them, and we are just visitors they tolerate. Until they stop tolerating us, I said. Yes, every few decades there is a period of increased activity. Disappearances, encounters, deaths that get attributed to bears or falls or exposure, but that have details that do not quite fit. Then things go quiet for a while, and people forget. Or they convince themselves they imagined what they saw. He looked at me with tired, knowing eyes. We are in an active period now, and you just became one of the few people to see one clearly and survive to describe it. What about the people who do not survive? Robert pulled out another file, this one marked restricted in faded red letters. These are the cases that do not get solved, he said quietly. Missing hikers whose bodies are never found. Hunters who vanish without a trace, children who wander into the woods and never wander out. He opened it, revealing a stack of missing person reports that went back decades. 23 people in the last 10 years in this district alone. The official explanations were always the same. Lost in the wilderness, fell into ravines, exposure, animal scavenging preventing recovery of remains. But Robert had added his own notes to each file, observations that painted a different picture. This one, he said, pointing to a report from 1994, a family camping at Hickory Flat, father, mother, 2 kids. The parents woke up in the middle of the night because something was moving around their tent. When they looked out, their younger daughter was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. They found her sleeping bag on the ground outside the tent and tracks leading into the forest, big tracks. Did they find her? Eventually. 2 days later, 3 miles from the campsite, sitting in a clearing and staring at nothing. She would not speak, would not eat, would not respond to her name. Doctors said it was catatonic shock, that something had traumatized her so badly her mind had shut down to protect itself. What happened to her? She is in a care facility in Roanoke now, 30 years old, has not spoken a word since that night. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. We need to close this section of the forest, I said. Put out warnings. Whatever this thing is, it is hunting people. Robert shook his head slowly. I have tried. Every time we have an incident, I file reports with the regional office. They send someone to investigate. They find nothing conclusive, and life goes on. The state cannot shut down thousands of acres of national forest because of unverified sightings and local folklore. The economic impact alone would be massive. Logging contracts, hunting permits, tourism. Without a body, without clear evidence of a threat from a known species, they will not act. I saw it, Robert. I looked it in the face. I believe you. But your eyewitness account of something that officially does not exist is not enough for the State Wildlife Board. They would write you off as another ranger who spent too many nights in the woods and let his imagination run wild. He leaned back in his chair, and in that moment he looked every one of his years and then some. So we do what we can. We patrol more frequently. We try to keep people out of the high-risk areas. We warn the ones who will listen and hope the ones who will not are lucky enough never to need the warning. And we wait. Wait for what? For it to end. For the activity to decrease like it always does eventually. For another generation to forget what lives in these mountains. He paused. or for it to get so bad that no one can ignore it anymore. Whichever comes first. The next morning, operating on no sleep and too much coffee, I drove to the nearest town, a small community called Blackwater Falls, about 20 miles south of the forest. The local sheriff, a man named Elias Parker, had worked with the Forest Service for decades. Robert thought he might have information that was not in the official reports. Sheriff Parker met me at a diner on the main street, a place called the Mountain View that looked like it had not changed since the 1960s. Parker was in his late 50s with a gray mustache and the solid build of someone who had spent more time outdoors than behind a desk. He ordered coffee and a plate of eggs without looking at the menu, the mark of a regular customer. "Robert called me last night," Parker said after the waitress walked away. "Said you had a close encounter up at Raven Rock." I told him everything: the destroyed campsite, the tracks, the camera, the thing I had seen in my flashlight beam. He listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee. "My father was a deputy in this county for 40 years, he finally said. "He told me stories when I was a kid, stories I thought were just mountain tales meant to scare children into staying out of the woods after dark. Stories about the thin people. That is what the old-timers called them, the thin people who lived in the deep hollows." "What did he tell you about them?" "That they have been here forever. Long before us, long before the Cherokee. Maybe long before anything human walked this earth. That the mountains are theirs and always have been. That they have rules, boundaries we should not cross, places we should not go. And when we break those rules, they remind us why they exist." Parker looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "My father went missing in 1978. Went into the forest to investigate reports of strange sounds up near Graveyard Ridge. Never came back. They found his patrol car at the trailhead, his gun still in the holster on the front seat. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. I am sorry. We searched for 3 weeks, covered every inch of that area. Never found a body, never found a single clue about what happened to him. The official report says he got lost, fell into a ravine somewhere. Body never recovered due to difficult terrain." Parker's jaw tightened. "But I know the truth. I always have. He went somewhere he should not have gone, and they took him." A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the diner. "There is something else," Parker continued. "The encounters, the disappearances, they are not random. Look at when they happen: late fall, winter, early spring, when the forest is at its quietest, when most people stay away. Like they come out of whatever deep place they live in when there are fewer humans around. Or like they get more desperate when their usual food becomes scarce. So they turn to us," I said quietly. "Or they have always hunted us, and we just notice more when they get aggressive." He pulled out a worn notebook, flipped through pages covered in cramped handwriting. "I have kept my own records," he said, cross-referencing every incident I could find going back to the 1920s. "There is a pattern. Every sighting, every encounter, every disappearance, they all happen in roughly the same area. About 40 square miles of the deepest forest up in the northern ridges." He showed me his hand-drawn map. Red dots marked incident locations, and they formed a rough circle in the heart of the forest, right in the center of my patrol area. "That is their territory," I said. "That is what I believe. And here is the concerning part." He pointed to the outer edge of the circle. "The incidents used to be contained to this core area, deep wilderness where nobody went anyway. But over the last decade, they have been spreading, moving outward, closer to the trails and roads and campgrounds. Like the boundaries are shifting, like their territory is expanding, or like their population is growing," I thought but did not say. We spent another hour going over Parker's research. He had documented dozens of incidents that never made it into official reports. Farmers who lost livestock to something that could tear through barn walls. Hunters who heard sounds in the darkness and abandoned camps worth thousands of dollars rather than spend another night in those woods. Truck drivers on the forest highways who swore they saw tall shapes crossing the road at night, shapes that moved too fast and wrong. "You want my advice," Parker said as we prepared to leave. "Do not patrol alone at night. I know that is not always possible, but when you can, bring another ranger, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the woods go too quiet, if you get that feeling like something is watching you, get out. Do not try to investigate. Do not try to be a hero. Just get out." As I drove back toward the forest, I called Robert on the radio. "I need to talk to some of the witnesses," I said. "The ones who survived encounters. Someone who might be willing to tell me what they experienced." Most of them will not talk, Robert replied. I have tried. But there is one man who might. His name is Thomas Brennan, the hunter who called 911 from that ridge shelter last winter. He still lives in the area, about 10 miles west of the station. I can give you his address, but I cannot promise he will talk to you. He is pretty shaken up still. Thomas Brennan lived in a cabin set back from the main road, surrounded by open meadow with cleared sight lines in every direction. His property had a different feel from the surrounding forest, more exposed, more defensible. I noticed security lights mounted on poles around the cabin and cameras positioned to cover all the approaches. This was a man who no longer felt safe, even in broad daylight. He answered the door on the third knock. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 40s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors. A hunting rifle was visible in his hand, held casually but ready. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Ranger?" he asked. His voice was flat, guarded. "Yes, sir. I am the new ranger assigned to the Northern Patrol area. I was hoping I could ask you some questions about your experience last winter." His jaw tightened, and I saw his grip on the rifle shift. "I gave my statement to the police," he said. "To Robert, to anyone who asked. I am done talking about it. I understand, but I saw it last night. The same thing you saw." That got his attention. His eyes searched my face, looking for any sign that I was mocking him or doubting his story. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside, the cabin was neat but lived in. A wood stove provided heat, and the walls were decorated with hunting trophies: deer, turkey, a black bear. But I noticed that all the windows had been covered with heavy curtains, and there were multiple deadbolts on both the front and back doors. A scanner sat on the kitchen table, quietly monitoring emergency frequencies. Thomas poured us both coffee, and we sat at his kitchen table. He stared into his cup for a long moment before speaking. "I have been hunting these mountains my whole life," he said. 20 years in these forests specifically. I know every trail, every creek, every ridge. I know how animals move, how they sound, how they smell. That thing," he stopped, collecting himself. "That thing is not an animal, not any animal that should exist. Tell me what happened." He took a breath, and I watched him travel back to that night, watched the fear return to his eyes. January 14th. I had set up in a ridge shelter on Graveyard Mountain, planning to do some winter scouting for spring hunting season. Got there about 3 in the afternoon, set up my camp, had dinner as it got dark. Everything normal. The woods were quiet, but that is typical in deep winter. Not many animals moving around. "When did you first notice something was wrong?" "Around 9 that night. I was in my sleeping bag, reading by lantern light, when I heard something moving in the trees below the shelter. Heavy footsteps, breaking through the frozen crust of snow. At first I thought it was a bear, maybe one that had not denned up yet, but bears do not move like that. They crash around, make noise. This was careful, deliberate. This was something that knew exactly where it was going. Did you see it?" "Not at first. It stayed in the dark, circling the shelter. I could hear it moving, around and around, getting closer each time. That is when I realized it was not hunting deer or looking for food in my camp. It was hunting me." The fear in his voice was real and fresh, like he was reliving that night. I stayed still, tried not to make any sounds that might attract its attention. But it did not matter. This thing knew I was there. It kept circling, and then it started making sounds. What kind of sounds? At first, clicking, like someone snapping their fingers, but faster, more rhythmic. Then it started humming, this low vibrating sound that I could feel in my chest more than hear with my ears. And underneath that, I could hear it breathing. In and out, but wrong, like it was practicing the sound rather than actually needing to breathe. He looked at me, and I saw something break in his expression. Then it spoke. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. Spoke. Not words exactly, but it made sounds with its mouth that were trying to be words. Sounds that were shaped like language but came from a throat that was never meant to speak. I could almost make out patterns, almost hear what it was trying to say. And somehow, that was worse than if it had just been growling or howling. It got dark, and I thought about trying to make a run for it, but I could still hear it out there, moving through the trees. Then around midnight, it came into the clearing around the shelter, and I saw it. His hand shook as he raised his coffee cup. It was tall, taller than any person should be, maybe 8 feet, maybe more. The body was wrong in ways I cannot describe, like someone had taken a person apart and put them back together without knowing what a person should look like. The arms were too long and bent in too many places. The legs were the same. And the face, Thomas shuddered. The face was the worst. Features all in the wrong positions. Eyes too far apart. Mouth too low. And all of it watching me with this intelligence that made me want to crawl out of my own skin. How long did it stay? Hours. It circled the shelter, sometimes on two legs, sometimes dropping down and moving on all fours. It would stop and look at me through the gaps in the shelter walls, and I swear it was studying me, learning how I moved, how I breathed. At one point, it stood right outside and reached up, and its hand came through a gap in the roof, fingers longer than any human fingers should be, reaching toward where I was lying. That is when you called 911? I had been too scared to move, too scared to even reach for my phone, but when I saw that hand coming through the roof, I knew I had to do something or I was going to die in that shelter. So I grabbed my phone and called, told them where I was, told them something was trying to kill me. The dispatcher probably thought I was having a breakdown, but she sent help anyway. When did it leave? Not until it heard the sirens. The state police came up the logging road with lights and sirens going, and the thing heard them coming from miles away. It turned its head toward the sound, and I swear it looked disappointed, like a kid who has to stop playing before the game is finished. Then it just walked away, back into the forest, moving fast, not running, but not walking either. It disappeared into the trees like it had never been there. We sat in silence for a moment. Finally, I asked the question I had been dreading. Have you seen it since? Thomas stared into his coffee for a long time before answering. No, not seen it. But I hear it sometimes at night. That humming sound, that clicking, out there in the forest, in the direction of the deep hollows. And sometimes, he paused, sometimes I hear it trying to talk, making those sounds that are almost words, like it is practicing, getting better. He looked at me with haunted eyes. I used to love these mountains, spent my whole life in them, felt more at home in the forest than anywhere else. Now I cannot even walk to my mailbox after dark without a gun in my hand. And even then, I know it would not do any good. Not against that thing, not against whatever it is. Before I left, Thomas showed me something else. A notebook he had started keeping after his encounter, filled with sketches of what he had seen that night, along with notes about every strange sound or occurrence since then. I drew these the next day, he said, while the memory was still fresh. I had to get it out of my head somehow. The drawings were rough but detailed. They showed a figure that made my stomach turn. A creature of impossible angles and wrong proportions, captured in stark pencil strokes. Looking at them, I felt like I was seeing my own encounter reflected back at me. There is more than one, Thomas said. Has to be. The sounds I hear, they come from different directions sometimes, like they are calling to each other, communicating. Whatever they are, there is a whole population of them living in those mountains. As I drove away from Thomas's cabin, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the forest, I felt the weight of knowledge settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. This was not a case of mistaken identity or exaggerated tales. Something was living in these woods, something that had been here long before humans arrived and would probably be here long after we were gone. Something that watched us, studied us, and occasionally took us for purposes I did not want to imagine. And I had 4 more nights of patrols ahead of me that week, alone in the dark, in their territory. That evening, before my next patrol, I sat in the ranger station cleaning my shotgun. Robert watched me from across the room, his face unreadable. Load it with slugs, he said, not buckshot. If you have to shoot, you want maximum stopping power and penetration. I looked at him. You really think this thing can be stopped with a shotgun? I do not know. No one has ever managed to kill one as far as I know. Or if they have, they did not survive to tell anyone about it. But I would rather you have the best chance possible if it comes to that. He handed me a box of shells. And keep your radio on no matter what, he continued. If something happens, I want to know about it immediately. Do not go radio silent. Do not try to handle things alone. If you see something, you call it in and you get out. Before what? I asked. Before you become another missing person report. The next 3 nights passed in tense routine. I patrolled the forest roads, checked campgrounds, investigated reports of suspicious activity. I saw nothing unusual. No tracks, no destroyed campsites, no glimpses of anything that should not exist. The forest seemed almost normal, peaceful even, and that worried me more than anything. Predators do not just disappear. They watch, they wait, they learn their prey's patterns. Every night that passed without incident felt like a countdown, like something was building toward an event I could not prevent. On the fourth night, November 7th, everything changed. I had started my patrol later than usual, around 9 in the evening, because of a department meeting that ran long. The October had turned to November, and the mountain air had turned bitter, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. My breath fogged in the truck's cab as I drove north on Logging Road 347, a rutted track that wound deep into the forest toward the core of what Parker had called their territory. The radio crackled. "Unit 7, this is base. We have a 911 call about strange sounds heard near the old Hendricks cabin on Backbone Ridge." Caller was pretty shaken up. "Can you respond?" I checked my map. Backbone Ridge was about 25 minutes northeast of my current position, deep in the backcountry. The Hendricks cabin was an abandoned structure from the 1930s, left over from a logging operation that had failed during the Depression. It was supposed to be off-limits to the public, but that did not stop urban explorers and thrill-seekers from making the hike up there. "Copy that. Base. What did the caller hear?" There was a pause before Robert answered. She said she heard someone trying to talk, someone who did not know how. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought of Thomas Brennan describing that thing making sounds that were shaped like language, but came from a throat that was never meant to speak. "I am heading there now," I said. "Be careful. The caller and her friends are still at the cabin. They are too scared to leave in the dark. I told them to stay inside and wait for you." I drove faster than I should have on those rough forest roads, branches scraping against the truck's sides, rocks clanging against the undercarriage. The Hendricks cabin was accessible by a logging road that dead-ended about half a mile from the structure, then a hiking trail the rest of the way. When I reached the trailhead, I found 3 vehicles parked at the turnaround, 2 cars with out-of-state plates and an SUV with a local tag. I grabbed my gear, shotgun, heavy flashlight, radio, and started up the trail at a jog. The forest was absolutely silent. No night birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing but the crunch of my boots on the packed earth and the harsh rhythm of my breathing. My flashlight beam swept back and forth across the trail, revealing nothing but trees and shadows, but I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond the light's reach. The cabin came into view after about 15 minutes, a dark shape hunched at the edge of a small clearing. No lights visible in the windows, which struck me as wrong. If people were hiding inside, they would want light. They would need light. I slowed my approach, sweeping the area with my flashlight. The cabin was a single-room structure, maybe 20 feet square, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. The door was hanging open, swinging slightly in a breeze I could not feel. "This is the Park Service," I called out. "Is anyone here?" For a moment, nothing. Then a voice from inside the cabin, trembling and high with fear. "Help us. Please help us. It is out here with us. It has been circling the cabin for hours." I approached the door carefully, keeping my light and my shotgun trained on the tree line. "I am Ranger," I said. "I am here to get you out. How many of you are there?" 3. We are 3. We came up to explore the cabin and something found us. It started making sounds and we hid inside, but it will not leave. It keeps circling. It keeps talking. Where is it now? A pause. I could hear whispered conversation inside. "We do not know. It went quiet about 10 minutes ago. We cannot see it anymore, but we know it is still out there." "Okay. I need you to stay inside for now. I am going to make sure the area is clear. Then I will escort you back to your vehicles. Do not come out until I tell you it is safe." I swept the clearing with my light, looking for any sign of movement, any tracks, anything that might indicate where the creature had gone. The ground around the cabin was covered in dead leaves and pine needles, making tracks difficult to see. But near the northeast corner, I found what I was looking for. A partial print in a patch of soft earth, 18 inches long, 5 misshapen toes pressed deep into the mud. It had been here, recently. I continued around the cabin, following the perimeter, and that is when I found the rest of the tracks. They circled the structure multiple times, overlapping, creating a pattern in the earth like something had been pacing, watching, waiting for an opportunity. The tracks led away from the cabin toward the south, deeper into the forest, but they were strange. In some places, the creature had clearly been walking upright, those big humanoid prints spaced 5 feet apart. But in others, there were additional impressions, handprints, as if it had dropped to all fours and moved like an ape. And then the tracks simply stopped. I stood at the edge of the tree line, staring at the last visible print. Beyond it, the ground was covered in undisturbed leaves, as if the creature had simply ceased to exist, or risen into the air. Or, I forced myself to think the thought, climbed. I looked up. The trees here were massive oaks and hemlocks, some of them with trunks 5 feet in diameter and branches that interlocked overhead to create a canopy of darkness. My flashlight beam could not penetrate more than 20 or 30 feet up, leaving the higher reaches shrouded in impenetrable shadow. Something could be up there right now, looking down at me, and I would never know. I backed away from the tree line, my shotgun raised, and made my way back to the cabin. "I need you all to come out now," I said through the door. "Stay close to me, do not run, and do not look back. We are going straight to the vehicles." The door opened and 3 figures emerged, 2 young women and a young man, all in their early 20s. Their faces were pale and streaked with tears, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that goes beyond normal panic into something deeper, something primal. We started down the trail, me in the lead with my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the 3 survivors clustered behind me. I moved as quickly as I dared, trying to balance speed with caution, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. We were about halfway to the vehicles when I heard it, that humming sound, low and vibrating, coming from somewhere to our left. It rose and fell in that distinctive pattern I remembered from my own encounter, almost rhythmic, almost musical. "Keep moving," I said quietly. "Do not stop." The humming shifted, moving ahead of us now. It was circling, positioning itself between us and the vehicles. I stopped, sweeping my light toward the sound. The beam illuminated trees, undergrowth, shadows that seemed to move and shift just beyond the edge of visibility. Then the humming stopped, and something else began. "What is your name?" The words came from perhaps 30 yards away, from somewhere in the darkness to our right. They were slurred and wrong, each syllable drawn out and warped, like someone speaking a language they had only heard but never learned to produce. One of the women behind me started to sob. "What is your name?" The voice was closer now, coming from a different direction. It had moved without making a sound. "Keep moving," I hissed, pushing the group forward. "Do not answer it. Do not engage with it." We stumbled down the trail, and I could hear it following us, moving through the trees on our flanks, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just out of sight. And it kept talking, kept trying to form words. "What is your name? Where are you going? What is your name? What is your name?" The repetition was the worst part. Not the wrong pronunciation or the inhuman voice, but the repetition, the mechanical quality, like a machine learning to speak by running the same phrase over and over, getting infinitesimally better each time. I saw the vehicles ahead, dark shapes at the end of the trail, and I had never been so grateful to see anything in my life. "Get in your cars," I ordered. "Lock the doors, start the engines, and follow me out. Do not stop for anything." We reached the turnaround, and the 3 survivors sprinted for their vehicles. I heard doors slamming, engines turning over, and then headlights blazed to life, pushing back the darkness. In that moment of illumination, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet from the vehicles, was a figure that made my mind recoil. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, its body a collection of wrong angles and impossible proportions. The skin was that same bark gray I remembered, stretched tight over a frame that seemed to have too many joints. And the face, that terrible wrong face, was watching us with eyes that reflected the headlights like amber mirrors. Its mouth moved, forming shapes that might have been words. "What is your name?" I raised the shotgun and fired. The slug hit the creature in the chest, and for a moment, nothing happened. It just stood there, looking down at the wound with what might have been curiosity. Then it looked back at me, tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve, and smiled. At least I think it smiled. The mouth stretched wider, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too irregular, and it made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could sound like bones breaking underwater. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving with that impossible fluid grace, and was gone. I did not lower the shotgun until all 3 vehicles were moving, until we were out of the forest and onto the main highway, until the lights of the ranger station came into view. The 3 survivors, a graduate student named Maya Hartwell, her roommate Sophia Chen, and Maya's boyfriend Derek Palmer, gave their statements to me and Robert over the next 2 hours. Their accounts matched perfectly. which in my experience usually means people are telling the truth. Lies have variations. Witnesses to real events remember the same details. They had hiked up to the Hendricks cabin in the late afternoon, planning to take photos for a project on abandoned structures in Appalachia. Everything had been normal until sunset. Then Maya had seen something moving in the trees, a tall shape that seemed to blur at the edges, like her eyes could not quite focus on it. Before she could say anything to her friends, the humming started. They had run for the cabin and barricaded themselves inside, using old furniture to block the door. For the next 5 hours, the creature had circled the structure, occasionally stopping to scratch at the walls or peer through gaps in the boarded windows. And it had talked. That was what terrified them most. It had tried to communicate, using words it had clearly learned by listening to humans, words it did not understand but could reproduce with increasing accuracy. At one point, Derek said, his voice hollow, it asked what we were afraid of. Over and over. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Like it was curious. Like it wanted to know. After they finished their statements and left with strict instructions to contact me or Robert if they remembered anything else or experienced any further incidents, I sat alone in the station's main room, staring at the topographical map on the wall. Robert found me there an hour later. They are getting bolder, he said. That was the closest to the main road we have ever had a sustained encounter. I know. The shot you took. You hit it? Yes. 12-gauge slug, center mass from maybe 50 feet. It barely reacted, just looked at the wound like it was interesting, then smiled at me and walked away. Robert was quiet for a moment. I need to make some calls, he finally said. There are people who need to know about this. People who might have resources we do not. Who? He did not answer directly. There are agencies, he said carefully, that keep track of things like this. Things that are not supposed to exist. They do not advertise their existence, and they do not always help, but they should know what is happening here, especially if these things are becoming more aggressive. He left me alone with my thoughts, which were dark company indeed. Over the next week, the situation deteriorated rapidly. On November 9th, a pair of hikers on the Appalachian Trail found a campsite that had been torn apart. The tent was shredded, the camping gear scattered, and there were tracks everywhere. Those distinctive 18-inch prints mixed with 4-point impressions where the creature had moved on all fours. The hikers who found the site were experienced outdoorsmen. They took one look at the tracks and practically ran the 15 miles back to the nearest trailhead. On November 11th, a hunting party reported being followed through the forest for 3 hours. They never saw anything clearly, but they heard the humming, the clicking, and occasional sounds that were almost words. By the time they made it back to their vehicles, one of the hunters, a 60-year-old man named Warren Miller, was having chest pains from the stress. He survived, but swore he would never set foot in the Appalachian forests again. On November 12th, we found the body. A day hiker named Kevin Brooks had gone missing 2 days earlier. He was experienced, well-equipped, and familiar with the trails. His car was found at a trailhead near Graveyard Ridge, the same area where Sheriff Parker's father had disappeared decades ago. The search and rescue team found Kevin's body about 3 miles off the trail, in a rocky hollow that the maps did not even have a name for, or what was left of his body. The official report would list the cause of death as animal attack, species unknown. The unofficial details were worse. Kevin Brooks had not just been killed, he had been taken apart with surgical precision. Certain organs were missing entirely. His clothing had been removed and folded neatly beside the remains, and his face, according to the search and rescue coordinator who had found him, his face looked peaceful. Not terrified, not pained, peaceful. Like he had accepted what was happening to him, like he had been convinced it was okay. The federal investigators arrived 2 days later. Robert introduced them simply as representatives from a special wildlife management division, but I had my doubts. They did not carry themselves like wildlife researchers. They moved with military precision, spoke in clipped sentences, and asked questions that suggested they already knew the answers but wanted to hear them from us. There were 3 of them. The leader, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes to match, introduced herself as Dr. Victoria Hendricks. The irony of her sharing a name with the abandoned cabin was not lost on me. We have been monitoring reports from this area for several years, Doctor, Hendricks said during our first briefing. Activity levels have been increasing steadily, but the incident with the hikers at the cabin represents a significant escalation. These creatures have historically avoided direct confrontation with humans. The fact that one was willing to spend hours stalking a group and attempt communication suggests behavioral changes we need to understand. What are they? I asked. You seem to know more than you are letting on. Dr. Hendricks exchanged a glance with her colleagues. We do not know for certain, she said. What we do know is that they are not a recent phenomenon. We have documented reports going back hundreds of years, not just in Appalachia, but across North America. Indigenous peoples have stories about them that predate European contact by centuries. Whatever they are, they have been here for a very long time. And what do they want? Another glance between the investigators. We believe they are predators, Dr. Hendricks said carefully. Highly intelligent predators who have learned to avoid detection while maintaining a presence in wilderness areas. They appear to be opportunistic, taking prey, including humans, when the opportunity presents itself without too much risk. She paused. But the recent behavior suggests something new. The attempts at communication, the increased boldness, the apparent study of human behavior. It is as if they are becoming more interested in us, not just as prey, but as, she struggled for the word, as subjects of investigation. The thought chilled me more than anything else I had heard. You think they are studying us, I said, learning about us. We think it is possible. These creatures have demonstrated intelligence that rivals or exceeds human levels. If they have decided to take a more active interest in human behavior, the implications could be significant. What kind of implications? The kind that keep people like me employed, Doctor, Hendricks said, and that was all she would say on the subject. Over the next week, the federal team conducted their own investigation. They set up monitoring equipment throughout the forest, devices I did not recognize that they said measured everything from electromagnetic fields to subsonic vibrations. They collected samples from every encounter site, tracks, hair, biological residue, and sent them to laboratories they would not name. They interviewed every witness who would talk to them, asking questions that went far beyond what local law enforcement had thought to ask, and they asked me to continue my patrols. You have established a presence in their territory, Dr. Hendricks explained. They know you now. They have seen you, studied you, possibly even come to associate you with the human presence in these woods. If we want to understand their behavior, we need someone they recognize, someone they might approach. You want me to be bait, I said flatly. We want you to be an observer. Continue your normal patrols. Note any unusual activity, any sounds, any signs of their presence, but do not engage. If you see one, maintain distance and document what you can. And if it approaches me, then you will learn something valuable about their intentions. I wanted to refuse. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, that I was being used as a sacrificial pawn in a game I did not understand. But I thought about Kevin Brooks, about his peaceful face, about the missing organs and the neatly folded clothes. I thought about Maya Hartwell hiding in that cabin while something circled outside, trying to learn words. I thought about all the missing person reports in Robert's restricted file. Someone had to do something. Someone had to try to understand. Fine, I said. But I want better equipment, better communications, and I want backup on standby if things go wrong. Done. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. Every night, I drove the forest roads, checking campsites, walking trails that wound through their territory. I wore a body camera that Dr. Hendricks had provided, along with a radio that could reach the federal team's monitoring station from anywhere in the patrol area. I carried my shotgun loaded with slugs, though I no longer believed it would do any good against what I had seen. The first week passed without incident. The forest seemed empty, quiet, normal. I began to wonder if the creatures had retreated deeper into the wilderness, spooked by all the attention. Then, on November 25th, I found the message. I was checking a remote campsite near the edge of their territory when I saw it. Carved into the bark of a massive oak tree, at a height of about 8 feet, were words. Actual words, written in crude but legible letters that had been gouged into the wood by something with claws or very strong fingers. What is your name? I stood there staring at those 4 words for what felt like hours. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and seeping sap. It had been done recently, within the last day or 2. They were learning, not just to speak, but to write. They had seen human writing somewhere, perhaps on trail signs or at campsites, and they were reproducing it, trying to communicate in our own language. I photographed the carving from every angle, then keyed my radio. This is Unit 7. I have found something you need to see. Dr. Hendricks and her team arrived within an hour. They examined the carving with the same clinical detachment they applied to everything. But I could see something behind their professional masks, something that might have been fear. "This confirms our hypothesis," Dr. Hendricks said. "They are actively attempting to bridge the communication gap. They want to talk to us." "Why?" I asked. "What could they possibly want to say?" She looked at the carving, then at the dark forest beyond the reach of our lights. "That," she said, "is what we need to find out." They set up cameras and monitoring equipment around the tree, hoping to catch the creature returning to its message. Then we left, retreating to the ranger station to analyze the footage and plan our next move. But I could not stop thinking about those carved words. "What is your name?" Such a simple question, such a human question, and yet, coming from something that should not exist, something that had killed and fed on people for generations, the question took on a different meaning. They wanted to know who we were. They wanted to understand us, and I was terrified of what they might do with that understanding. December arrived cold and early that year. Snow came to the mountains, not enough to close the roads, but enough to make the forest a study in white and gray and black. The federal team continued their monitoring, but the creatures seemed to have gone quiet again. No sightings, no sounds, no more messages carved into trees. Dr. Hendricks said they were probably denning, waiting out the deepest part of winter in whatever deep caves or hollows served as their homes. But she did not sound convinced. None of us were convinced. It felt more like they were waiting, watching, planning. On December 14th, I received a call that changed everything. It was Thomas Brennan. "I need you to come to my place," he said. His voice was strange, calm in a way that did not match his words. "Something has happened. Something you need to see." I drove to his cabin with a growing sense of dread. When I arrived, Thomas was standing on his porch, rifle in hand, staring at the tree line. "It came last night," he said as I approached, walked right up to the edge of the cleared area and stood there, watching my house. "What did it do?" "Nothing. Just watched. For hours. I could see it in my security cameras. It never moved, never made a sound. Just stood there until sunrise, then walked away." He led me to his security monitoring station, a bank of screens connected to the cameras around his property. He rewound the footage and pressed play. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. At first, the camera showed only the empty tree line, snow-covered ground, dark forest beyond. Then, at the very edge of the frame, something moved. A tall shape emerged from the trees and simply stood there. The night vision camera rendered it in shades of green and white, but the proportions were unmistakable. Too tall, too thin, arms too long, joints bent at wrong angles. For 4 hours and 37 minutes, according to the timestamp, it did not move. It simply stood there facing Thomas's cabin, watching. Then, at 4:24 a.m., it turned its head and looked directly at the camera. It held that pose for exactly 30 seconds, as if making sure the camera got a good look at its face, at those mismatched eyes and that too-wide mouth arranged all wrong on a face that should not exist. Then it smiled, turned, and walked back into the forest. "It knows I am watching," Thomas said. His voice was hollow, empty. "It wants me to know that it knows. It is playing with me. Or maybe," his voice cracked, "maybe it is trying to communicate. That smile. Maybe it was trying to be friendly." I looked at the frozen image on the screen, at that twisted mockery of a human smile, and I did not think it looked friendly at all. I called Dr. Hendricks and told her what had happened. She arrived within the hour with her team and began analyzing the footage with their equipment. But I could tell from her expression that this was something new, something unexpected. "They have never done this before," she admitted. "Approached a known witness's home, stood in the open for hours. This is not predatory behavior. This is," she struggled for the word, "this is diplomatic." "Diplomatic," I repeated. "They are making contact. On their terms, in their way. But contact nonetheless." Thomas Brennan saw one up close and survived. Now they are showing themselves to him again, but not attacking. They are establishing a relationship. "A relationship with what end?" Thomas asked. His voice was tight with controlled panic. Dr. Hendricks did not answer, but I saw something in her eyes that I did not like. Something that looked almost like excitement. Over the next week, the visits continued. Every night, between 11 and midnight, a creature would emerge from the tree line and stand at the edge of Thomas's cleared property. Sometimes it was the same one, or at least what appeared to be the same one. Other times, there were differences, variations in height and proportion that suggested multiple individuals. They would stand for hours, watching the house, then leave before dawn. Thomas was falling apart. He had not slept in days, could not eat, jumped at every sound. He had started drinking to dull the terror, but alcohol only made the fear worse. I tried to convince him to leave, to stay with family or friends until this was over, but he refused. "If I run," he said, "they will follow. They have chosen me for something. I can feel it. Running will not change that." On December 21st, the longest night of the year, they finally made their move. I was at Thomas's cabin that night, along with 2 members of Dr. Hendrix's team. We had set up additional cameras and monitoring equipment, hoping to gather more data on the creature's nocturnal visits. The snow had been falling steadily all day, blanketing the forest in white silence. At 11:43 p.m., the first one appeared at the tree line, then another, then another. Within minutes, there were at least a dozen of them, standing in a rough semicircle at the edge of the cleared area, their tall forms dark against the white snow. We watched on the monitors, barely breathing. Then they began to move. Not toward the cabin, but in a coordinated pattern, walking slowly in a wide circle around the property. Their movements were synchronized, each creature maintaining perfect distance from the others, their long legs moving in unison. "They are performing," Dr. Hendrix whispered. "This is a ritual of some kind. A demonstration." The circle completed once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped, all of them facing the cabin. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the largest one, the one that had been appearing every night, stepped forward. It walked across the snow-covered ground, moving with that impossible fluid grace until it stood about 50 feet from the front porch. Then it stopped and raised one long arm, palm outward, the universal gesture of peace. "Oh my God," someone said. I think it was me. The creature stood there, arm raised for what felt like an eternity. Then it lowered its arm and did something I will never forget for as long as I live. It spoke, not the garbled attempts at words I had heard before, not the mechanical repetition of phrases it had learned by listening, actual speech, actual language. "We are neighbors." The voice was wrong, inhuman, each syllable pronounced with careful precision by a throat that was never designed to produce human sounds. But the words were clear, the meaning was unmistakable. "We have watched you for long time." It paused, and when it spoke again, I could hear something in its voice that might have been emotion, might have been sincerity. "We want to understand you." Dr. Hendrix was recording everything, her hands shaking slightly as she held the camera. Thomas was frozen beside me, his face white as the snow outside. The creature waited, as if expecting a response. When none came, it continued. "You are afraid. We know. We were also afraid of you for long time." It paused again, and I saw its misplaced eyes focus on the cabin windows, on the pale faces watching from inside. No more fear. Time to talk. Then it turned and walked back to join the others at the tree line. They stood there for a moment, that semicircle of impossible beings, and then, as one, they turned and melted back into the forest. None of us spoke for a long time after they were gone. I am writing this now in March of 2002, 4 months after that night. Much has happened in that time, much that I am not sure how to process or explain. Dr. Hendrix and her team established a formal communication protocol with the creatures, a slow and painstaking process of learning each other's languages and intentions. The creatures, it turns out, have been watching humanity for millennia. They remember when the first humans arrived in North America. They remember when we were few and weak and posed no threat to their territories. They remember when we became numerous and loud and began cutting down their forests and polluting their waters. They have been afraid of us for a very long time. Afraid of our numbers, our weapons, our seeming ability to reshape the world to our liking. They have hidden in the deep places, the old places, the forgotten corners of the wilderness, watching us expand and wondering when we would finally find them and try to destroy them. The attacks, the disappearances, those were not predation. They were fear responses. Defense mechanisms triggered by humans who wandered too close to their homes, their young, their sacred places. They never wanted to hurt us. They were simply terrified of what we might do to them if we knew they existed. What changed? I asked Dr. Hendricks during one of our debriefings. You did, she said. You and Thomas Brennan. You saw them, encountered them at close range, and you did not attack. You did not organize hunting parties or call for their extermination. You were afraid, yes, but you tried to understand. They noticed that. They have been watching humanity for a long time, and they had never seen that response before. It gave them hope. Hope for what? That we might be ready. That the time might finally have come when our two species can stop being afraid of each other and start being, she smiled slightly, neighbors. The formal contact program is ongoing. I have been asked to stay on as a liaison, a bridge between the Forest Service and the team working to establish diplomatic relations with the creatures. It is strange work, stranger than anything I ever imagined when I became a ranger, but it feels important, necessary. The creatures are still out there in the deep forest, still watching, still waiting. But now, when I patrol those dark roads at night, I do not feel only fear. I feel something like wonder. Something like hope. We are not alone in these ancient mountains. We never have been. And maybe, just maybe, that is not something to fear. But I still keep my shotgun loaded with slugs, just in case. Some habits are hard to break. Some fears never quite go away. And the Appalachian forests are old and dark, and they hold secrets that even our new neighbors do not fully understand. The silence still presses against my eardrums on those long night patrols. My heartbeat still sounds like thunder in the darkness. But now, when I hear that humming in the trees, when I see those amber eyes watching from the shadows, I do not run. I stop. I wait. And sometimes, if I am very still, I can hear them trying to speak, trying to find words for thoughts that have never been shared with a human mind, trying to bridge a gap that has existed since before either of our species had a name for fear. What is your name? They asked me once. And finally, I answered them. This is my story. This is what I witnessed. And I am telling you now because you need to understand. The woods are watching. They always have been. And what watches from those dark places between the ancient trees is not evil, is not monstrous, is not the enemy we always assumed it would be. It is just different, alien, old, and it is ready, at last, to talk. The only question is whether we are ready to listen. Some nights, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, I drive out to the edge of their territory and turn off my engine and my lights and just sit there in the silence. Sometimes, if I wait long enough, one of them will come to the edge of the tree line and stand there watching me, and I will watch back. We do not speak, not with words anyway, but there is a conversation happening, a slow, patient exchange of trust and curiosity and wonder that has been building for tens of thousands of years and is only now, finally, finding its voice. They have names, I have learned, names that cannot be spoken in human languages, names that are expressed in patterns of movement and changes in the texture of their skin and harmonics of that strange humming they make. But they have given me a name I can say. The one who stayed. Because when everyone else ran, I stayed. When I had every reason to flee in terror, I stayed. And that, apparently, meant something to them. It marked me as different, as someone worth trying to understand. I think about Thomas Brennan often, about those long nights he spent watching the forest, watching the watchers. He has gotten better since the contact was established, since he understood that what visited his cabin was not there to hurt him, but to study him. He still does not go into the deep woods anymore, but he has stopped jumping at shadows. He has started sleeping again. We meet sometimes for coffee at the diner in Blackwater Falls, two men who have seen things that should not exist and somehow found a way to live with that knowledge. We do not talk about it much. We do not need to. The understanding is there, shared and silent, a bond forged in fear and wonder and the strange beauty of the unknown. Sheriff Parker retired last spring. He said he wanted to spend his remaining years not thinking about the things that live in the mountains. I cannot blame him. But before he left, he gave me his father's old badge, the one that was found in the patrol car all those years ago. They gave it back, Parker said. One of them came to my house last month, left it on the front porch, no note, no explanation, just the badge. He looked at me with eyes that had finally, after all these years, found some peace. I think they were saying sorry. I keep that badge in my desk drawer now. a reminder that these creatures are capable of things we do not yet understand. Regret, apology, the recognition that harm was done and amends should be made. These are not the behaviors of mindless monsters. These are the behaviors of thinking, feeling beings who are grappling with the same moral complexities that humans have struggled with since we first developed the capacity for guilt. The world is stranger than we know. The wilderness holds wonders and terrors that science has not yet named. And the boundaries between us and them, between human and other, between fear and understanding, are not as fixed as we once believed. I am still a ranger. I still patrol these ancient forests, still walk the trails that wind through their territory, still listen to the silence that presses against my eardrums in the deepest parts of the night. But I do it now with a different purpose, a different understanding. I am not just protecting people from the wilderness anymore. I am protecting the wilderness from people, and I am trying, in my small way, to build a bridge between two worlds that have been afraid of each other for far too long. It is slow work, patient work, the kind of work that will not be finished in my lifetime, or perhaps in many lifetimes. But it is work worth doing, because the alternative is what we have always had: fear, violence, disappearances in the night, bodies found in remote hollows, peaceful faces and missing parts. A shadow war that neither side can ever truly win. I choose the other path, the harder path. The path of understanding and patience and the terrifying vulnerability of reaching out to something that could destroy you and hoping, praying, that it reaches back in peace. "What is your name?" they asked me. I told them. And now, night after night, patrol after patrol, conversation after halting conversation, we are learning each other's stories. This has been mine. The forests are still dark. The mountains are still old. And the silence still has weight, still presses down with the accumulated memory of ages before humans walked these ridges. But in that silence now, I sometimes hear something new, something that sounds almost like hope. The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets close. They always have, and they always will. But some secrets are not meant to stay hidden forever. Some secrets are waiting for us to be ready. Waiting for us to grow up, to stop being afraid, to become the kind of beings who can look into the darkness and see not enemies but neighbors. I think we are finally ready. Earl Whitmore had not seen another car in 40 miles, and the headlights of his old Dodge carved weak tunnels through the snow, while somewhere behind him, back where the road bent around Dead Horse Creek, he had lost the signal from KB&D, and now there was only static and the moan of wind pushing against the cab like something wanting in, and his daughter Loretta slept in the passenger seat with her coat pulled up to her chin, and every few minutes Earl glanced at her just to watch the small fog of her breath against the window because the storm had come down from the Cascades faster than the radio said it would, and by the time they passed, the old Perkins sawmill visibility had dropped to nothing, just white and white and white. And he thought of his wife Mabel waiting back in Prineville with the porch light on, probably watching the weather map and turning her wedding ring the way she always did when she worried, and he told himself he would call her from the next town, but he did not know yet that there would be no next town not for him. Ice had been creeping over the side mirrors since sundown, layering itself on with patient inevitability, the kind that knows you are not going anywhere, and every couple of miles I would lean out the driver's window and hack it away with my glove. But the cold won that argument every single time, and my name is Silas Brennan, and I have worn a Forest Service badge pinned crooked on a coat older than the Ponderosas I was supposed to protect for nearly 23 years. And I was the last ranger stubborn or stupid enough to be driving that stretch of highway that night, through what the old-timers around here call the Whispering Pines, a name that sounds almost quaint until you have spent enough winter nights out here alone and learned that pines do not whisper on their own. Dusk erased the timberline the way memory does, with no sharp lines, just shapes bleeding into gray, and the pines stopped being trees and became sentinels watching the road disappear. And visibility dropped below 200 feet, and beyond that there was white nothing, and snow came in sideways, driven hard by wind that spoke in a language older than roads, and the plows had passed just far enough back for the shoulders to start reclaiming what was theirs, and I kept the truck centered in the cleared lane, hunting for reflectors that kept vanishing into the storm, and the wipers screamed uselessly at full speed, and the radio had been dying for 20 minutes with scattered static and ghost voices, and once the name Harlan cutting through before the hiss swallowed it whole. And that was when I noticed the forest had stopped talking, because there was no wind in the branches and no distant engines and nothing but tire noise, and the creeping certainty that something beyond the tree line had finally turned to look my way. I have worked search and rescue in these mountains since the winter of 1999, and in that time, I have seen things that do not fit into the reports we file, and I have learned to recognize when the forest changes its mood, the way you learn to recognize when a conversation has shifted from friendly to something else. And tonight, the mood was wrong in a way I could feel in the base of my skull, like pressure before a storm. Only there was already a storm, and this was something underneath it. Something watching and waiting and patient in a way that made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter, even though there was nothing I could see to be afraid of yet. The radio crackled, and I heard dispatch trying to reach me, and the voice was Luna Vance, who had worked the night desk for longer than anyone could remember, and her voice kept breaking up. But I caught fragments of words like missing and trailhead and family, and I grabbed the handset and keyed the mic and said, "This is Brennan. Go ahead," and there was static. And then Luna came through clearer saying, "We have a missing persons report, and a family of 4 failed to return from a day hike on the Ridgeback Trail. And last contact was around 3 this afternoon, and can you respond?" And I looked at my fuel gauge and looked at the wall of white beyond my windshield, and I knew I should probably say no and wait for the storm to pass. But something in me said yes, because that is what we do, and that is what I have always done, even when every instinct told me to turn around. The Ridgeback Trail was about 6 miles north of my current position, and to get there, I would have to take the old logging road that cut through the densest part of the Whispering Pines, and that road had not been maintained properly in years, and in weather like this, it would be barely passable even in my truck. But I told Luna I was responding, and she said copy. And then the radio went to static again, and I was alone with the storm, and the trees and whatever was out there waiting. I turned off the main highway and onto the logging road, and immediately the world became darker, because the trees pressed in on both sides, and their branches hung low and heavy with snow, and my headlights barely penetrated 20 feet before the darkness swallowed them, and I drove slow, keeping my speed under 15 miles per hour because the road was rutted and icy, and one wrong move would put me in a ditch where nobody would find me until spring. And as I drove, I thought about the family that was out there somewhere in this, and I wondered if they had any idea how much trouble they were in, because day hikers almost never did, and they would look at a trail map and see that it was only 4 miles round trip, and they would think that sounded easy, and they would not check the weather, and they would not tell anyone where they were going, and they would not bring emergency supplies, because who needs emergency supplies for a 4-mile hike? And then the storm would roll in, and suddenly 4 miles might as well be 400, and the forest would close around them like a fist. The missing family was the Aldridges, according to the information Luna had managed to relay before the radio cut out, and there was Vernon Aldridge, age 52, and his wife Constance, age 48, and their 2 children, a boy named Theodore who was 16, and a girl named Patience who was 12, and they were from Portland originally, but had been staying at a rental cabin about 10 miles south of here, and they had signed the trail register at the Ridgeback Trailhead at 11:30 that morning, with an estimated return time of 3 o'clock. And when they had not returned by 5, the owner of the rental cabin had called the sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department had called us. And now here I was, driving into the teeth of a blizzard looking for 4 people who might already be beyond help. The logging road curved sharply to the left, and I followed it. And as I came around the bend, my headlights swept across something that made me hit the brakes hard, and the truck skidded on the ice before coming to a stop. And I sat there, with my hands frozen on the wheel, staring at what the lights had revealed, because standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet ahead was a figure, and it was just standing there motionless facing my truck. And the snow was coming down so hard that I could not make out any details, just a dark shape that was roughly the size and proportions of a person. But there was something wrong about the way it was standing, because it was too still, and I mean unnaturally still in the way that living things are not supposed to be. and I watched for a full 30 seconds, and the figure did not move at all, not even the slight sway that you would expect from someone standing in a wind like this, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I reached for my radio. But it was still just static, and I honked my horn twice, and the sound was immediately swallowed by the storm, and the figure did not react at all, and I sat there trying to decide what to do. Common sense said I should drive closer and see who it was, because it could be one of the Aldridges, and they could need help, and that was why I was out here in the first place. But something deeper and older than common sense was telling me not to move, and not to get out of my truck, and not to take my eyes off that figure for even a second. And I have learned to trust that instinct over the years, because it has saved my life more than once. And right now, that instinct was screaming at me that something was very wrong. And I sat there in my truck with the engine running and the heater blowing, and I watched the figure in my headlights, and it did not move, and the snow kept falling, and the minutes stretched on and on. Then the figure moved, and it happened so fast that I almost missed it, because one moment it was standing in the middle of the road, and the next moment it was gone. And I did not see it walk away, or run away, or move in any direction at all. It was just there, and then it was not. And I stared at the empty road, and felt my heart pounding in my chest, and I sat there for another full minute waiting to see if it would come back. But the road stayed empty. And finally, I put the truck in gear, and drove forward slowly, with my hand on the spotlight switch, ready to flood the tree line with light if anything moved, and I passed the spot where the figure had been standing, and I looked for footprints in the snow, but there were none, and the snow on the road was smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had been standing there at all, and I knew that was impossible, because I had seen it, and I was not crazy, and something had been there, even if it had left no trace. I kept driving, and the logging road continued deeper into the whispering pines, and the trees grew taller and closer together, and the darkness between them became absolute, and my headlights created a small bubble of light that moved with me through the blackness. But beyond that bubble, there was nothing, and anything could have been watching me from just outside the reach of the light, and I would never have known. And I tried not to think about that, because thinking about it would not help, and I had a job to do, and 4 people were counting on me, even if they did not know it. The trailhead parking area appeared on my right about 15 minutes later, and I pulled in slowly, sweeping my headlights across the lot, and there was one vehicle parked there, a dark green minivan that matched the description Luna had given me for the Aldridge family, and the van was covered in about 3 inches of snow, which told me it had been sitting there since the storm started, and I parked next to it, and killed my engine but left my headlights on, and I sat there for a moment listening to the wind and the tick of my cooling engine. And I did not want to get out of my truck, but I knew I had to. I grabbed my pack from the back seat and checked my gear one more time, and I had my flashlight and my radio and my flare gun and my first aid kit and a thermal blanket and some emergency food and water, and I had done this 100 times before, but tonight felt different, and I could feel the wrongness in the air, like electricity before lightning, and I told myself I was just spooked from the figure on the road, and that there was a rational explanation for everything, and I did not believe myself, but I got out of the truck anyway, because that was the job. The cold hit me immediately, and it was the kind of cold that finds every gap in your clothing and works its way inside, and I pulled my hood up and tightened the drawstrings, and I walked over to the Aldridge minivan and looked inside, and there was nothing unusual, just some water bottles and snack wrappers and a kid's coloring book on the back seat, and the keys were not in the ignition, which meant they had taken them on the hike. And I walked over to the trail register and opened it and found their entry from that morning, just like Luna had said, with Vernon Aldridge's neat handwriting listing all 4 names and their intended destination, which was the overlook at the end of the Ridgeback Trail, about 2 miles from here. I signed in myself and noted the time and the conditions, and then I started up the trail. The first half-mile was relatively easy because the trail was wide and well-maintained, and my flashlight cut through the falling snow well enough to see where I was going. But as I climbed higher, the trail narrowed, and the trees pressed in closer, and the wind became fiercer, and I had to lean into it to keep moving forward, and the snow was already up past my ankles and getting deeper with every step, and I knew that if the Aldridges were somewhere up ahead, they were in serious trouble, because they had been out here for hours now, and even with proper gear, the cold would be getting to them, and if they did not have proper gear, well, I tried not to think about that. I stopped to catch my breath about a mile in, and I turned off my flashlight for a moment, just to let my eyes adjust to the darkness, and I stood there in the falling snow and listened to the wind in the trees, and that was when I heard it. And at first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, and it was a voice, and it was calling something, and I turned my flashlight back on and swept the beam across the trees, but I could not see anything, and I called out hello, and my voice sounded thin and weak against the storm, and there was no response, and I waited and listened, and there it was again. A voice, definitely a voice, and it sounded like it was coming from somewhere off to my left, deeper in the trees and away from the trail, and it sounded like it was saying help. I left the trail and pushed into the trees following the voice, and the snow was deeper here, and the going was harder, and branches slapped at my face and grabbed at my coat, and I kept calling out, hello, is anyone there? And the voice kept calling back, help, please help. And it sounded closer now, and I was getting closer, and I pushed through a thick stand of firs and came out into a small clearing, and I swept my flashlight around, and the clearing was empty, and there was nobody there. And I stood there panting from the exertion, and the voice came again. Help, please help. And it was coming from behind me now, from the direction I had just come from. And that was impossible because I had just walked through there and there was nobody there. And I turned and shined my light back the way I had come, and the beam caught something moving in the trees, and I only saw it for a fraction of a second before it was gone. But I saw enough, and it was not a person, or if it had once been a person, it was not anymore. And I felt every hair on my body stand up, and I started backing away slowly, and the voice came again. Help, please help. And it sounded exactly like it had before, the exact same words in the exact same tone and the exact same cadence, and I realized that it was not a voice at all, but something imitating a voice, something that had learned to make the sounds but did not understand what they meant. I turned and ran back toward the trail, not caring about the branches that whipped my face or the snow that tried to trip me, and I ran until I found the trail again, and I kept running until I had to stop to breathe, and I bent over with my hands on my knees and gasped for air, and the voice did not follow me, and the forest around me was silent, except for the wind, and I stood there trembling from more than just the cold, and I tried to make sense of what had just happened, and I could not. And I told myself that I had imagined it, that the storm was playing tricks on me, that isolation and stress could make people see and hear things that were not there. But I knew that was not true, and I knew what I had seen and what I had heard, and I knew that something was out here in these woods, something that should not exist. But the Aldridges were still missing, and I was still the only one who could help them, and I could not turn back now, so I forced myself to keep moving up the trail toward the overlook, and I kept my flashlight beam fixed straight ahead, and I did not look into the trees, and I did not stop when I thought I heard the voice again in the distance behind me, because I knew now that following it would only lead me to something I did not want to find, and I climbed higher, and the wind grew stronger, and the snow came down harder, and I started to lose feeling in my fingers and toes despite my gloves and boots, and I knew I was approaching the limits of how long I could stay out here. I found the first sign of the Aldridges about a quarter mile from the overlook, and it was a child's mitten, bright purple with little yellow flowers on it lying in the snow beside the trail, and I picked it up and brushed the snow off, and it was wet and cold, and I looked around, but there was no sign of the child who had dropped it, and I put the mitten in my pocket and kept moving. 100 yards further, I found a hiking pole, one of those expensive aluminum ones that people buy at outdoor stores, and it was lying across the trail like someone had dropped it in a hurry, and I picked that up too and kept going. Then I found the first body. She was lying in the snow just off the trail, and at first I thought she was just resting, but as I got closer, I saw that her eyes were open and staring at nothing, and her face was the color of old wax, and I knew before I even checked for a pulse that she was dead, and she was Constance Aldridge based on the description I had been given, and she was wearing a light jacket that would have been fine for a spring day, but was completely inadequate for weather like this, and she had no hat and no gloves, and she had died of exposure probably hours ago, and I felt sick because I had known this was possible, but knowing something and seeing it are two very different things. I checked her pockets looking for any clue about what had happened and where the rest of her family might be, and I found a cell phone with a dead battery and some tissues and a protein bar, and nothing else. And I covered her face with my bandana because it seemed like the right thing to do, and I marked the location on my GPS, and I kept moving because there were 3 more Aldridges out there, and maybe some of them were still alive. The overlook was just ahead now, and I could see where the trail widened into a viewing platform that looked out over the valley below. Except tonight, there was no view, just white and gray, and the howling wind, and I climbed up onto the platform and swept my flashlight around, and I found Theodore Aldridge huddled against the low stone wall that surrounded the platform, and he was alive barely, and his lips were blue and his skin was gray. But when I shined my light in his eyes, he blinked and tried to speak, and I got down beside him and wrapped my thermal blanket around him and asked him where his father and sister were. He could barely talk, and his words came out slurred and broken, but I managed to understand that they had gotten separated on the way down from the overlook and that something had been following them, and that his father had told him to stay here while he went to look for patients, and that was hours ago, and Theodore had not seen either of them since. And I asked him what he meant by something was following them, and he looked at me with eyes that were too wide and too scared, and he said it kept calling for help, but it was not a person, and I felt my blood go cold because I knew exactly what he was talking about. I told Theodore that I was going to get him out of here, but first I needed to find his father and sister, and he grabbed my arm with a strength that surprised me given his condition, and he said, "No, please do not leave me alone." And his voice cracked with terror, and I looked at this 16-year-old boy who was probably going to lose fingers and toes to frostbite if he had not already, and I knew I could not leave him. But I also could not carry him and search for the others at the same time, and I was alone out here because the radio was still not working and no backup was coming, and I had to make a choice. I decided to get Theodore back to the parking lot first because he was alive and hypothermic and needed medical attention immediately, and the others might already be dead, like Constance and I could not save everyone, but I could try to save him. So I got him to his feet and put his arm over my shoulders, and we started back down the trail, and it was slow going because he could barely walk. And I was essentially dragging him, and the snow kept coming down, and the wind kept howling, and somewhere out there in the darkness, the thing that had been imitating voices was still moving and still hunting, and I tried not to think about that as we stumbled down the trail toward the parking lot. We made it about halfway before Theodore collapsed and could not get up again no matter how much I encouraged him, and I realized I was going to have to carry him, and I was not young anymore, and carrying a 150-pound teenager through knee-deep snow for a mile was going to take everything I had. But there was no other option, so I got him onto my back in a fireman's carry, and I started walking, and every step was agony, and my legs burned and my lungs burned, and the cold bit into every exposed inch of skin, and I focused on putting one foot in front of the other and not thinking about anything else. I do not know how long it took to reach the parking lot, but when I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw my truck sitting there with the headlights still on and the engine still running, because I had left it that way, I nearly wept with relief, and I carried Theodore to the truck and got him into the passenger seat and cranked the heater up to maximum and wrapped him in every blanket I had, and I tried the radio again, and this time Luna answered, and I told her I had one survivor and one confirmed fatality and two still missing, and I needed medical evacuation and backup immediately, and she said copy, and the line went to static again, but I knew she had heard me and help would be coming. I sat in my truck with Theodore and I watched him start to shiver, which was actually a good sign because it meant his body was warming up, and I told him he was going to be okay, and I did not know if that was true, but it seemed like the right thing to say, and he looked at me with those terrified eyes and asked if I was going to find his dad and his sister, and I said yes, even though I was not sure I believed it, and he nodded and closed his eyes, and I sat there in the warmth of the truck and listened to the storm rage outside and waited for backup. The first responders arrived about 45 minutes later, and by then, the storm had started to ease slightly, and visibility had improved to maybe a quarter mile, and they came in a convoy of vehicles including an ambulance and two more Forest Service trucks and several county deputies. And I handed Theodore over to the paramedics and gave my preliminary report to the incident commander, who was a woman named Rachel Whitfield, whom I had worked with before, and I told her about Constance, and about Vernon and Patience still being missing, and I told her about the voice in the woods, and she looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, and said, "What do you mean a voice?" I told her what I had heard, and what Theodore had told me, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We will send teams out at first light, because it was too dangerous to search in the dark," and I said, "But they could still be alive," and she said, "Silas, I know, but I am not going to lose anyone else tonight," and she was right, and I knew she was right, but it did not make me feel any better. I did not sleep that night, and instead I sat in the warming shelter at the trailhead and drank bad coffee and watched the snow continue to fall and thought about Vernon and Patience out there somewhere in the dark, and I thought about the thing I had seen in the trees and the voice that kept calling for help, and I thought about all the other disappearances that had happened in these woods over the years, disappearances that had never been explained and had been filed away as accidents or exposure or animal attacks, even when the evidence did not quite fit, and I wondered how many of those had involved. Something like what I had encountered tonight. Dawn came slowly gray and cold, and the snow had stopped, but the clouds hung low, and the visibility was still poor, and the search teams assembled at the trailhead, and I insisted on joining them, even though I had not slept, and Rachel looked at me like she was going to argue, but then she just nodded and assigned me to a team with two other rangers, and we headed back up the trail. We found Patience first, about half a mile off the main trail in a direction that did not make any sense because it led deeper into the forest and away from the parking lot. And she was dead, like her mother had been dead with her eyes open and staring, and her face frozen in an expression of terror, and she was lying in a small hollow beneath a fallen tree, as if she had been trying to hide from something, and her hands were raised in front of her face, as if she had been trying to ward something off. And I looked at her, and I felt something break inside me because she was 12 years old, and she had died alone and afraid in the cold and dark, and whatever had killed her had not been the weather. We found Vernon about an hour later, and he was about 300 yards from where we found Patience, and he was also dead, but he had not died from exposure because his neck was broken and his body was twisted at an angle that suggested he had fallen from a great height, except there was nothing nearby that he could have fallen from. No cliff, no tree, no structure, just flat ground and deep snow, and a dead man with a broken neck. And the other rangers looked at each other and nobody said anything. But we were all thinking the same thing, which was that none of this made any sense. We brought the bodies down and the ambulance took them away, and the incident commander interviewed everyone who had participated in the search. And when it was my turn, I told her everything, including the figure on the road and the voice in the woods and the thing I had seen in the trees, and she wrote it all down and thanked me for my service and sent me home. I did not go home, and instead I drove to the district office and pulled the files on every missing person case from the Whispering Pines over the past 50 years, and there were more than I expected, many more. And as I read through them, I started to see patterns that nobody had noticed before, or maybe nobody had wanted to notice, because noticing would mean admitting that something was wrong and something was out there, and nobody wanted to admit that. There was Abner Polk, who went missing in 1967 while hunting alone, and whose body was never found, even though search teams covered every inch of the area where he was last seen. There was the Kavanaugh family, who disappeared in 1974 while camping at the old Forest Service campground, and whose car was found with all their belongings still inside, but no sign of any of them ever again. There was Delilah Jameson, who was an experienced backpacker with 20 years of wilderness experience, who went into the Whispering Pines in 1982 and never came out, and whose last journal entry mentioned hearing voices calling for help that seemed to come from every direction at once. There was Luther Beckham, who was a forest ranger like me, who disappeared in 1989 while investigating reports of strange noises near the Ridgeback Trail, and whose truck was found at the trailhead with the engine still running, but Luther himself was never seen again. There were dozens of others over the decades, and the official explanations varied, but they all had one thing in common, which was that they did not explain anything. And reading through them, I realized that what had happened to the Aldridges was not new and was not isolated, and had been happening for as long as anyone could remember, and probably longer. And the forest had been taking people all along, and we had just been pretending otherwise. I kept working in the Whispering Pines for another 3 years after that night because someone had to, and because I knew what was out there now, and I figured knowing was better than not knowing, even if knowing meant I could not sleep anymore without seeing Patience Aldridge's face in my dreams. I learned to recognize the signs that meant trouble was coming, and I learned that the thing in the woods was more active during certain times of year, especially around the winter solstice, and I learned that it seemed to target people who were alone and isolated and vulnerable. And I learned that the best way to survive an encounter was to not engage and to keep moving, and to never, ever follow the voices, no matter how real they sounded or how desperate they seemed. I started keeping my own files on strange occurrences, and I interviewed old-timers who had lived near the forest for generations, and some of them knew things that they had never told anyone before, because who would believe them? And their stories went back further than the official records, much further, and they talked about their grandparents and great-grandparents who had spoken of something in the woods that was older than the trees themselves, and that had been here before the first settlers arrived and would be here long after we were all gone. There was old Ezekiel Hammond, who was 93 years old and who had lived in a cabin near the edge of the Whispering Pines his whole life, and who told me that his father had told him never to answer if he heard someone calling for help in the woods, because it might not be a person doing the calling. There was Hester Buford, who was 87, and who told me that her grandmother had called the thing in the woods the caller, and had said that it could mimic any voice it heard, and would use the voices of the dead to lure the living. There was Otis Grantham, who was in his late 70s and who told me that the Klamath tribes, who had lived in this area before the settlers, had a name for the thing in their language that roughly translated to that which wears many faces, and they had considered these woods sacred and forbidden, and had never gone into them except when absolutely necessary. The more I learned, the more I realized that we were dealing with something beyond my understanding, and probably beyond anyone's understanding, and the best we could do was try to minimize the damage by warning people and keeping them out of the most dangerous areas and responding quickly when something went wrong. And that was what I did for those 3 years. And I saved some people, and I lost others, and I never forgot any of them. I retired from the Forest Service in 2017, and I moved to a small town about 50 miles from the Whispering Pines, far enough that I could not hear the wind in those trees anymore, but close enough that I could still keep an eye on things. And I still hear from former colleagues sometimes when something happens that they cannot explain, and I tell them what I know and what I suspect. And most of them think I am crazy. But some of them listen, and some of them have learned from my experience, and that is about as much as I can hope for. The official report on the Aldridge family deaths said they died from exposure after becoming lost in a blizzard. And that is what their death certificates say, and that is what the newspapers reported at the time. And in a way, it is even true because they did die from exposure, and they did become lost in a blizzard. But it does not tell the whole story, and it does not mention the thing that was hunting them, and it does not explain why Vernon's neck was broken in a place where there was nothing to fall from, and it does not explain why Patience was found with her hands raised as if to ward something off, and it does not explain the footprints I found later when I went back to the scene, footprints that did not belong to any animal I could identify and that started and stopped in places that made no sense, as if whatever had made them could move through the forest without leaving a trail when it wanted to. Theodore Aldridge survived his ordeal, and I kept in touch with him for a while afterward, and he told me more about what had happened that night, more than he had been able to tell me in the immediate aftermath when he was hypothermic and in shock, and he told me that the thing had been following them since they left the Overlook, and that it had kept calling to them in his sister's voice, even while Patience was standing right next to him, and he told me that his father had finally gone to investigate one of the calls, thinking it might be someone else who was lost, and that was the last time anyone saw Vernon alive. And he told me that he and Patience had tried to make it back to the parking lot on their own, but the thing kept circling them and cutting them off and herding them deeper into the forest. And he told me that Patience had finally broken and run, and that the thing had chased her. And he told me that he had heard her screaming, and then the screaming had stopped. And then there had been silence, and then the thing had started calling in Patience's voice, calling for help just like before. And that was when Theodore had hidden at the Overlook and prayed that whatever was out there would not find him. I asked Theodore once if he had actually seen the thing, and he got very quiet and said yes once. And I asked him what it looked like, and he said he did not know. And I said, "What do you mean you do not know?" And he said it was dark and it was snowing, but he had seen it between the trees, and it had been tall, taller than any person should be, and it had been thin, too thin, and its proportions had been wrong in ways he could not quite describe. And the worst part, he said, was its face, or what should have been its face, because when his flashlight beam had crossed it for just a moment, there had been no face, just smooth, pale skin where a face should have been, and then it had moved back into the shadows, and he had not seen it again. Theodore moved away from Oregon after that, and I do not blame him. And I heard he went to Arizona or New Mexico, somewhere dry and flat with no forests, and I hope he found some peace there, but I suspect he still has nightmares, because I still have nightmares, and I was only out there for one night, while he was out there for hours with that thing hunting him. The Whispering Pines are still there, of course, and they will be there long after I am dead. And they are still beautiful in their way, with the old-growth Douglas firs and the western red cedars and the mountain hemlocks reaching toward the sky, and people still go there to hike and camp and fish, and most of them come back without incident, and most of them never see or hear anything unusual, and maybe that is because whatever lives in those woods does not hunt all the time, or does not hunt everywhere, or only targets certain people for reasons we cannot understand, and maybe the old-timers were right that there are rules that the thing follows even if we do not know what those rules are. But some people do not come back, and some people see things they cannot explain, and some people hear voices calling from the trees, voices that sound exactly like their loved ones, or voices that sound like strangers begging for help, and some of those people make the mistake of following those voices, and some of those people are never seen again. And the Forest Service keeps filing reports about accidental deaths and exposure and animal attacks, and I keep reading those reports and recognizing the patterns and knowing that the official explanations are not quite right. I wrote this account because I wanted there to be a record, because I wanted someone to know what is really out there in the Whispering Pines, even if most people will not believe it. And I am old now, and I do not know how much longer I have, and I wanted to set down what I know while I still can. If you are reading this and you are planning to visit the Whispering Pines, I am not going to tell you not to go because people will go anyway, and because the forest is beautiful and because most visits are perfectly safe, but I will tell you to be careful and to never go alone, and to always tell someone where you are going and when you expect to be back, and to check the weather, and to bring proper gear, and to stay on the marked trails, and above all else, to never ever follow a voice calling for help, no matter how real it sounds or how desperate it seems, because it might not be a person doing the calling. And if you find yourself lost in those woods and night is falling and the wind is picking up and you start to hear something moving in the trees just out of sight, and then you hear a voice, a familiar voice calling your name, calling for help, remember what I have told you and keep moving and do not stop and do not answer and find your way back to the trail and get out of there as fast as you can. Because the thing in the Whispering Pines is old and patient and hungry, and it has been taking people for longer than anyone can remember, and it will keep taking them long after we are all gone, and there is nothing we can do to stop it, and the best we can hope for is to survive. That is my story, and that is my warning, and I hope you never need to use it. But if you do, I hope it helps, and I hope you make it out, and I hope I am wrong about everything, and the forest is just a forest, and the sounds I heard were just the wind, and the thing I saw was just my imagination, and the deaths were just tragic accidents. But I do not think I am wrong, and I do not think you should take that chance. Sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I think I can hear it even from 50 miles away, and I think it can hear me too, and I know it remembers me, just like I remember it. And sometimes I wonder if it is waiting for me to come back, and sometimes I think about going back just to see, just to know for sure what is really out there. But I never do, because I am old and I am tired and I have seen enough death, and because deep down I know that if I go back into those woods, I will not come out again. The last thing I want to tell you is this. I have spent my whole life in the forest, and I have loved the forest, and I still love the forest, even after everything that has happened. But I have also learned to fear it in a way that most people never will, because I know what lives in the dark places between the trees, and I know what it can do, and I know that for all our technology and all our knowledge, we are still just prey when we enter those woods, and the only thing that keeps us safe is luck and ignorance and staying on the path, and sometimes that is enough, and sometimes it is not. The Aldridge family thought they were safe, and they were not, and Delilah Jameson thought she was experienced enough to handle anything, and she was not, and Luther Beckham thought that being a ranger would protect him, and it did not, and I thought I understood what I was dealing with, and I was wrong about that too, because the truth is, nobody understands what is out there, and nobody ever will, because it is beyond understanding, and the best we can do is respect it and fear it and hope it does not notice us. And on that night, 3 years ago, when I carried Theodore Aldridge out of the storm on my back and got him to safety, I thought I had beaten the thing in the woods and I thought I had won, but now I am not so sure, because winning would mean it was a fight, and it was never a fight. It was always just a hunt, and the only reason I survived was because it let me go, and the only question is why, and that is a question I have been asking myself every night since then, and I still do not have an answer. Maybe it was not hungry that night, or maybe I did something right without knowing it, or maybe it just wanted me to survive so I could tell this story and draw more people into the forest, more prey, more victims, or maybe there is no reason at all, and it is just random and meaningless, and we are all just rolling dice every time we step into those woods and hoping we get lucky. I do not know, and I will never know, and that is the part that haunts me more than anything else. The not knowing, the uncertainty, the feeling that I am missing something important, something that would explain everything if I could just figure it out, but I never can, and I never will. The Whispering Pines are still there, and they are still beautiful, and they are still deadly, and they will be there long after I am dead, and long after everyone reading this is dead, and whatever lives in those woods will still be hunting and still be calling and still be wearing many faces and still be waiting for the next person to wander off the trail and follow a voice into the darkness. And that is the end of my story, but it is not the end of the story, because the story has no end, because it keeps happening over and over again every year, every season, every time someone goes into those woods and does not come out, and every time someone hears a voice calling for help and makes the mistake of answering. The engine of my pickup truck coughed and sputtered as I navigated the winding mountain road. October had painted the Appalachian wilderness in shades of rust and gold, but the beauty did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. I'd been driving for hours, following directions scrawled on a crumpled napkin to a place most folks pretended didn't exist. My name's Nathaniel Crow, and I'd come to these mountains looking for answers about my brother Silas Crow, who vanished 3 months ago. The authorities had given up. calling it another case of a hiker getting lost in the wilderness. But Silas had been raised on these ridges. He knew every switchback, every creek crossing. Something else had taken him, something the locals refused to name aloud, though their frightened whispers always circled back to one thing: the Wendigo. The gravel road ended at a weathered cabin pressed against the hillside like it had grown there. Smoke curled from the chimney. An old man sat on the porch, a knife flashing in his hand as he whittled. Folks later told me his name was Harlan Boone, and that he had been waiting for me long before my tires ever touched that road. Harlan looked up as I stepped out of the truck, his weathered face impassive. His eyes were the color of old coffee, and they studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're the Crow boy," he said. It wasn't a question. "Come looking for your brother, I suppose." I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. The old man set down his whittling and stood, joints creaking like old timber. He was taller than I'd expected, still strong despite his years. "Come inside," he said. "Night's falling, and you don't want to be out here after dark. Not anymore." The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. Harlan poured coffee from a pot that looked older than me, the liquid thick and bitter. He sat across from me at a rough-hewn table, his hands wrapped around his own mug. "Your brother came through here in July." He began without preamble. "Stayed one night. Asked the same questions everyone asks when they come looking for answers. About the disappearances. About what's out there in those woods." I leaned forward. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Harlan said simply. "That these mountains are old, older than memory. That there are things living in the deep hollows and high ridges that were here before the Cherokee, before anyone. Things that should have died out with the megafauna, but didn't. Things that learned to hide, to hunt, to survive in the spaces between what we know and what we fear." He pulled out a leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn. "I've been keeping records for 47 years, he said, opening it to reveal cramped handwriting and sketched maps. Every disappearance, every sighting, every track and sign. Your brother read all of this. He was particularly interested in the pattern." "Pattern?" I asked. Harlan turned the journal toward me, pointing to a hand-drawn map covered in red marks. "The disappearances aren't random. They follow corridors, paths through the forest that something uses to move unseen. Your brother figured out where these paths converged, where the heart of the territory might be." He traced a finger along the map to a circled area deep in the wilderness, Shadow Valley. No trails lead there anymore. The Forest Service closed it off in 1987 after a whole scout troop went missing. 13 boys and 2 leaders, gone without a trace. They found the camp intact, sleeping bags still rolled out, food still in the cookpots. But the people were gone. I studied the map, memorizing the landmarks. "Silas went there, didn't he?" Harlan nodded slowly. "I tried to stop him, but your brother was determined. Said he'd been having dreams, visions of something calling him. That's how it works sometimes. The thing out there, it gets in your head, makes you think you want to find it. By the time you realize the truth, it's too late." "What exactly is out there?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Harlan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "The old tribes called it the Wendigo, the hunger that walks. But it's older than their stories, older than any human memory. It's what happens when the line between man and beast breaks down, when survival becomes the only god you worship. It feeds on human flesh. But more than that, it feeds on fear, on desperation, on the darkness that lives in every human heart." He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the darkening forest. "I've seen it 3 times in all my years here. The first time was in 1976, just a glimpse through the trees. Tall as 2 men, thin as starvation, moving through the forest like smoke. The second time was in 1993, after those scouts disappeared. It was standing at the edge of my property, just watching. The antlers on its head spread wider than my arms could reach, and its eyes glowed like foxfire in the dark. "What about the third time?" I asked. Harlan turned back to me, and I saw fear in those old eyes. 3 nights ago. It came right up to the cabin, pressed its face against that very window. Its breath fogged the glass, and I could see its teeth, row after row of them, like a shark's mouth. It spoke, or tried to, made sounds that were almost words. And I swear to God, boy, it said your brother's name. My blood turned to ice water. "Silas? You're saying it spoke his name?" "Not spoke exactly," Harlan clarified. "More like mimicked. Like it had heard the name and was trying to reproduce it. That's what it does, you see. It learns. It adapts. The stories say it was once human, transformed by committing the ultimate taboo, eating human flesh to survive. But I think it's older than that. I think it's what humans become when they give up everything that makes them human. And your brother, God help him, I think he's becoming one of them." "That's impossible," I said, but my voice shook. "Silas would never." Harlan held up a hand. "Not by choice. But the Wendigo doesn't always kill its prey immediately. Sometimes it keeps them, breaks them down, drives them mad with hunger until they have no choice but to feed. And once they do, once they taste human flesh, the transformation begins. It's not instant. It takes time, weeks, maybe months. But eventually, the human disappears, and only the hunger remains." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I have to find him. If there's even a chance he's still alive, still himself, I have to try." Harlan sighed deeply. "I figured you'd say that. Can't say I blame you. If it were my kin, I'd do the same." He walked to an old trunk in the corner and pulled out a canvas pack. "I prepared this after your brother left. Knew someone would come looking eventually. Inside you'll find maps, supplies, and a few things that might help. Silver bullets, though I don't know if they actually work. Tobacco and whiskey. The old tribe said these were offerings that might appease it. And this." He pulled out a small leather pouch on a cord. "Protective charm from a Cherokee medicine woman. Won't stop it from killing you, but might keep it from taking your soul." I took the pack, feeling its weight. "Will you come with me?" I asked. Harlan shook his head. "I'm too old for that journey, and besides, someone needs to stay here. Keep watch. If you don't come back in 3 days, I'll contact the authorities. Tell them you went hiking and didn't return. They won't find you, but at least someone will know to look." I spent that night in Harlan's cabin, listening to him tell stories of the mountains, of the things he'd seen and heard over the decades. He spoke of lights in the sky that moved against the wind, of caves that echoed with sounds no animal could make, of trees arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. But always, the stories came back to the Wendigo, the constant, hungry presence that haunted these mountains. Before dawn, I set out, following Harlan's map into the wilderness. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places. Years of neglect had allowed the forest to reclaim it, and I had to fight through tangles of rhododendron and mountain laurel. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. By noon, I'd covered maybe 5 miles, though the difficult terrain made it feel like 20. I stopped to rest by a small creek, refilling my water bottles and eating a handful of trail mix. That's when I found the first sign, a footprint in the mud by the water's edge. It was human in shape but wrong in every other way. Too long, too narrow, with claw marks at the tips of the toes. The stride length suggested something much taller than a normal man. I photographed it with my phone, though I had no signal this deep in the mountains. I followed the tracks upstream, moving carefully, every sense alert. The forest grew denser, the canopy so thick that it felt like twilight even though it was early afternoon. Strange formations of rocks appeared, stacked in ways that seemed deliberate but served no obvious purpose. Trees bore marks, deep gouges in the bark that formed patterns I couldn't decipher. The smell hit me before I saw the source, a thick, cloying stench of decay mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong. I covered my nose with my shirt and pushed through a curtain of hanging vines. What I found made me gag. It was a clearing, maybe 30 feet across, littered with bones. Deer, bear, smaller animals I couldn't identify, all scattered and broken. But among them were things that didn't belong. A hiking boot with the foot still inside, a human skull with antlers growing from the temples, a rib cage that was too large to be human, but too human-shaped to be anything else. At the center of the clearing stood a structure made of bones and branches, woven together in a spiral pattern that seemed to move when I looked at it directly. Inside the structure was a bundle wrapped in what looked like deer hide. My hands shook as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I had to know. I pulled back the hide and immediately wished I hadn't. It was a body, or what was left of one. The face was partially transformed, human features stretched and distorted, teeth growing in rows, antler buds pushing through the skull. But I recognized the tattoo on the forearm. A compass rose with the words, "Not all who wander are lost," that Silas had gotten on his 18th birthday. I fell to my knees, bile rising in my throat. My brother was dead, or worse than dead. He was becoming something monstrous. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, my hand going to the pistol Harlan had insisted I carry. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and gaunt, wrapped in tattered clothes that might once have been a park ranger's uniform. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes, reflecting light like an animal's. "Hello, Nathaniel," it said, and the voice was wrong, like multiple people speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you." It stepped forward, and I saw its face clearly. It was human, or had been once. The features were gaunt, stretched over a skull that seemed too large. The mouth was wider than it should be, filled with teeth that belonged in a predator's mouth. But the worst part was that I recognized something in those features, a ghost of familiarity. "You were the ranger who went missing last year," I said, remembering the news stories. "David Chen." The thing that had been. David Chen smiled, an expression that involved too many muscles, moved in ways that human faces shouldn't move. I was. Now I am more. We all become more here, in the heart of the hunger. Your brother is changing, joining us. Soon you will too. More figures emerged from the forest, all in various stages of transformation. Some still looked mostly human. Others were barely recognizable as having once been people. They moved wrong, joints bending at impossible angles, their gaits sometimes bipedal, sometimes on all fours. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Chen tilted his head, considering. "Time means nothing here. We've been gathering for decades, maybe longer. The mountains call to certain people, those who carry the seed of hunger within them. Your brother heard the call. So did you, though you don't know it yet." "You're wrong," I said, raising the pistol. "I came here to find Silas, to bring him home." The creatures laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Home? This is home now. This is where all journeys end, in the belly of the beast. You can't fight what you are, Nathaniel. The hunger is already inside you. Haven't you felt it? The dreams that wake you at night, the craving for something you can't name, the way the forest seems to whisper your true name. I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. I had been having dreams, visions of running through the forest on all fours, of tasting blood and finding it sweet. I'd attributed it to stress, to worry about Silas, but now I wondered if it was something more. The thing wearing Chen's face stepped closer. "It's not a curse, you know. It's evolution. Humans think they're separate from nature, above it. But the Wendigo shows the truth. We're all animals, all driven by hunger. The only difference is that we've stopped pretending otherwise." I kept the gun trained on him, but didn't fire. Part of me was fascinated despite my terror. "What happened to you? How did you become this?" Chen settled onto his haunches, a disturbingly animal gesture. "I was like you once, searching for missing hikers. I found them, or what was left of them. But I also found something else. Understanding. The thing you call Wendigo isn't a creature, it's a state of being. It's what happens when humans stop fighting their true nature." He gestured to the bone structure behind me. "Your brother resisted at first, like they all do. But hunger is patient. Hunger always wins. We kept him alive for weeks, offering him food he wouldn't eat, showing him what he could become. Finally, his body betrayed him. The survival instinct took over. He fed, and once he fed, the transformation began. "You're lying," I said, but I could hear the desperation in my voice. "Silas would never—" "Never what?" Chen interrupted. "Never choose to survive? Never put his own life above abstract moral principles? You'd be surprised what people will do when they're starving, when death is the only alternative. We all like to think we're civilized, but civilization is just a thin veneer. Scratch the surface, and the beast emerges." A sound echoed through the forest, a howl that was neither human nor animal, but something in between. The creatures around me responded with their own calls, a cacophony of inhuman voices. "He's waking," Chen said. "Your brother. The transformation accelerates when family is near. Blood calls to blood. Would you like to see him?" I didn't want to, but I had to. I nodded, keeping the gun ready. Chen led me deeper into the clearing, to a cave entrance I hadn't noticed before. The smell was overwhelming here, decay and something else, something musky and animal. Inside the cave, illuminated by phosphorescent fungi, I saw him. Silas was suspended in a web of vines and sinew, his body contorting as I watched. His limbs were elongating, fingers stretching into claws. Antlers pushed through his skull with wet cracking sounds. His mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Nathan," he gasped, and for a moment his eyes were lucid, human. "Kill me. Please. Before I hurt someone." But even as he spoke, I could see the hunger in his eyes, the way he looked at me not as a brother, but as prey. I raised the gun, tears streaming down my face. My finger found the trigger. "No," Chen said softly. "That won't kill him. Not anymore. He's too far along. The transformation protects us, makes us harder to kill. Silver might slow him down, but it won't stop him. Only fire can truly destroy a Wendigo, and even then, the spirit of hunger simply finds a new host." "Then what am I supposed to do?" I screamed. "Just leave him like this?" Chen moved closer, and I could smell his breath, like rotted meat. "You could join him. The hunger is already in your blood, Nathaniel. I can smell it on you. Your brother's transformation awakened something dormant in your genetics. It's why you both heard the call. Some bloodlines carry the potential, passed down through generations. Usually, it stays sleeping. But sometimes when the conditions are right, when the forest calls strongly enough, it wakes." I thought of the dreams, the cravings, the way the forest had seemed to pull me here. Was it possible? Was I destined for this fate simply because of who my ancestors were? "You have a choice," Chen continued. "You can leave now, go back to your normal life, and spend the rest of your days fighting the hunger. It will grow stronger over time. You'll dream of the forest, of the hunt, of the taste of flesh. Eventually you'll return. They always do. Or you can accept what you are, embrace the transformation, and join your brother in a new existence." I looked at Silas, writhing in his cocoon of change. His human features were disappearing, replaced by something ancient and terrible. But in his eyes, when they briefly focused on me, I still saw my brother, trapped and terrified. "There's a third option," I said quietly. "I can end this. All of it." Chen laughed, that horrible sound like wind through bones. "You can't kill us all. We're too many, too strong. And even if you could, the hunger would remain. It's part of these mountains, part of the earth itself. It existed before humans, and it will exist long after we're gone." "Maybe," I said, "but I can try." I pulled out the bottle of whiskey Harlan had packed, along with the tobacco. I began walking in a circle, pouring the whiskey on the ground, scattering tobacco leaves. The creatures watched, amused at first, then growing agitated as they recognized what I was doing. The old ritual still had power here, in this place where the veil between worlds was thin. "Stop him!" Chen snarled, lunging forward. But he hit an invisible barrier, the circle I'd created with the offerings. The other creatures pressed against it, howling their frustration. "You can't hold us forever," Chen spat. "The barrier will weaken, and when it does—" I wasn't listening. I pulled out the flares from my pack, the ones Harlan had insisted I bring. "For emergencies," he'd said, but I think he knew what I might have to do. I lit the first one and tossed it into the bone structure. The dry materials caught immediately, flames racing through the construction. The creatures screamed, a sound that was physical pain to hear. Fire spread quickly in the clearing, catching the dry leaves and dead wood. The phosphorescent fungi in the cave began to smoke and burn with an eerie green flame. Silas's cocoon caught fire and his screams joined the chorus. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry, Silas." The barrier flickered as my concentration wavered. Chen burst through, his claws raking across my chest. Pain exploded through me as I fell backward, blood soaking my shirt. But I had one more flare, and as Chen loomed over me, jaws opening impossibly wide, I shoved it into his mouth and pulled the ignition. His head exploded in a burst of flame and gore. His body collapsed, twitching and burning. The other creatures fled into the forest, their howls echoing through the mountains. But some were too slow, caught by the spreading fire. They burned like dry kindling, their inhuman screams filling the air. I dragged myself to the cave entrance, watching as the flames consumed everything. Silas's screams had stopped. Through the smoke, I could see his form collapsing into ash. The transformation incomplete, his body couldn't survive the fire. It was over, or so I thought. As I stumbled away from the burning clearing, supporting myself on trees, I heard it. A whisper on the wind, words formed from the crackle of flames and the rustle of leaves. You can't kill hunger, Nathaniel. You can only delay it. You carry it within you now, sealed with your brother's blood. One day you'll return. They always return. I made it back to Harlan's cabin 3 days later, delirious from blood loss and infection. The old man found me collapsed on his porch, babbling about fire and hunger and Silas's eyes. He cleaned my wounds, forced antibiotics and whiskey down my throat, and sat with me through the fever dreams. When I finally woke, coherent and stable, a week had passed. "Did you find him?" Harlan asked simply. I nodded, unable to speak. He didn't press for details. Some stories don't need telling. The authorities conducted a search when I reported Silas missing, but they found nothing. The fire had consumed everything, leaving only a charred clearing that the Forest Service attributed to a lightning strike. Chen and the other missing people remained officially missing, their fates unknown. I returned to my life, my job as a surveyor, my apartment in Nashville. But things were different. Food tasted wrong, especially meat. I couldn't stand the smell of it cooking. I became a vegetarian, though even vegetables seemed flavorless. The dream started a month later. In them, I run through the forest on legs that aren't quite human. I hunt things I can't see, driven by a hunger I can't name. Sometimes, I see Silas in the dreams, not as the thing he was becoming, but as he was before, young and laughing. He tells me it's not so bad. The hunger, once you accept it. He tells me the fire didn't kill him, just freed him from his physical form. He tells me he's waiting for me in Shadow Valley, where the Wendigo spirit lives eternal. I wake from these dreams with dirt under my fingernails and leaves in my hair, though I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. I've started sleepwalking, my roommate tells me. He's found me standing at the window, staring toward the mountains, speaking in a language he doesn't recognize. I tell him it's stress, that I'm seeing a therapist. I don't tell him that the therapist's office is actually a Cherokee reservation where I meet with a medicine woman who teaches me the old protection rituals. She says the hunger is growing stronger, that my brother's death awakened something that can't be put back to sleep. She gives me herbs to drink, bitter teas that dull the cravings but make me feel disconnected from my own body. She teaches me prayers in Cherokee, words to speak when the hunger grows too strong. But she also tells me the truth, that there is no cure, only management. The Wendigo curse, once awakened, never fully goes away. It's been a year now since I lost Silas. The hunger is manageable most days, a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. I avoid the mountains, though they call to me constantly. I've moved to the coast, as far from the Appalachians as I can get without leaving the state. Salt water seems to help, or maybe it's just the distance, but I know it's temporary. The medicine woman told me that the hunger follows a cycle, growing stronger every 7 years. I have 6 more years before it reaches its peak, 6 years to find a permanent solution or accept my fate. I've been researching, traveling to indigenous communities across North America, learning about the Wendigo from those who've lived with its threat for generations. The stories are consistent. Once the curse is awakened, there are only 3 outcomes. You resist until you die, usually young, your body consuming itself when you refuse to feed the hunger. You give in, allowing the transformation, becoming the very monster you fear. Or you find a way to pass the curse to another, though this requires an act so horrible that most choose death instead. I won't describe that act here. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, but I think about it sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn when the hunger is strongest. I think about how easy it would be to end my suffering by ensuring someone else's begins. That's how the Wendigo truly spreads, not through bites or scratches like movie monsters, but through human choices. Through people deciding their survival matters more than their soul. Harlan writes to me occasionally. He tells me the mountains have been quiet since the fire, but he's noticed changes. More people going missing, but in a wider area, as if something is searching for new hunting grounds. He's documented strange sounds from Shadow Valley, voices that might be human or might be something pretending to be human. He thinks the Wendigo spirit, deprived of its physical hosts, is seeking new ones. He thinks it's calling to those who carry the bloodline, the genetic potential for transformation. He thinks it's calling to me. The worst part is, he's right. Every day the pull grows stronger. Every night, the dreams grow more vivid. I've started waking up outside, sometimes miles from my apartment, with no memory of how I got there. My feet are always pointed toward the mountains, as if my body knows the way home even when my mind resists. I've made preparations for when I can no longer fight it. I've written letters to be sent to specific people, warnings about bloodlines and places to avoid. I've documented everything I know about the Wendigo, creating a guide for those who might face it in the future. And I've made arrangements with the medicine woman. When the time comes, when I feel the hunger winning, she'll do what needs to be done. She'll ensure I don't become what Silas was becoming. She'll burn my body completely, scatter the ashes in running water, and perform the rituals to prevent my spirit from lingering. It's not much of a future, but it's better than the alternative. Sometimes, late at night when the hunger is quiet, I think about Silas. I wonder if I made the right choice, burning him before the transformation was complete. I wonder if there might have been another way, some cure I didn't know about, some ritual that could have saved him. But then I remember his eyes in those final moments, human and terrified, begging for death. I remember the thing he was becoming, the monster that would have worn his face while hunting others. And I know I did the only thing I could. I saved him from becoming something worse than dead. I saved others from what he would have done. And someday, someone will have to do the same for me. The Cherokee have a saying about the Wendigo. They call it the price of survival, the cost of choosing to live when death would be more merciful. They say every human carries the potential for it, the capacity to become monstrous in order to survive. The only difference between us and the Wendigo is that we haven't been pushed hard enough yet. We haven't faced the choice between death and damnation. But I have faced that choice. I face it every day, and every day I choose death even as I continue living, because I've seen what happens when you choose the other option. I've seen my brother's body twisting into something inhuman. I've seen the creatures that were once people, hunting their own kind with no memory of what they used to be. And I know that whatever suffering I endure by resisting the hunger, it's nothing compared to the horror of giving in. The mountain roads are calling me again. I can hear them in the wind, in the rain against my windows, in the space between heartbeats. Shadow Valley whispers my name, promises an end to the constant struggle. The Wendigo spirit is patient. It knows I'll return eventually. They always do, it says, and it's right. But not today. Today, I take my bitter tea and speak my prayers. Today, I choose to remain human, even as humanity becomes harder to maintain. Today, I remember Silas as he was, not as he was becoming. Today, I resist. Tomorrow, I'll resist again, and the day after that, until I can't anymore. And when that day comes, when the hunger finally wins, I hope someone loves me enough to do what I did for Silas. I hope someone sets me free with fire and grief and the terrible mercy of ending a monster before it fully wakes. The forest keeps its secrets and its hungers. Some of us are unfortunate enough to learn them, to carry them in our blood and bones. We are the guardians of a terrible knowledge, the keepers of warnings no one wants to hear. We are the infected, the cursed, the ones who stand between the normal world and the hungry dark. My name is Nathaniel Crow. My brother Silas died in Shadow Valley, or perhaps he was freed there. I carry the Wendigo curse in my blood, passed down through generations of my family. I will not let it claim me. I will not become the hunger that walks. This is my testimony, my warning, my confession. If you find this document, it means I've either conquered the curse or succumbed to it. Either way, remember this. The monsters in the mountains are real. They were human once, people like you and me who faced an impossible choice and chose wrong. They hunt still, in the deep places where civilization fears to tread, and somewhere in your ancestry, in the twisted branches of your family tree, the potential might be sleeping. Pray it never wakes. Pray you never hear the mountains calling your name. Pray you're never hungry enough to listen. But if you do hear it, if you feel that pull toward the dark forests and ancient peaks, remember my story. Remember Silas. Remember that some prices are too high to pay, even for survival. Choose the fire. Choose the ending. Choose to die human rather than live as something else. The Wendigo is patient, but it doesn't have to be inevitable. Every generation, a few of us resist. Every generation, a few of us choose death over damnation. We are the thin line between the human world and the hunger. We are the ones who say no, not today, not ever. Even as our bodies betray us and our minds fracture under the strain, we hold the line. For Silas, for all the ones who couldn't resist, for all the ones who still might be saved. The mountains are calling. They will always call. But today, I don't answer. Today, I remain myself. Today, the hunger doesn't win. And that's all any of us can do. Fight one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of resistance at a time, until we can't anymore, until someone who loves us sets us free. The forest is vast and dark and full of secrets. Some of those secrets have teeth. Some of them wear the faces of people we used to know. Some of them whisper our names in voices that sound like home. But we don't have to listen. We don't have to follow. We don't have to become. We can choose the harder path, the one that leads away from the mountains and toward the light. We can choose to starve rather than feed on others. We can choose to burn rather than transform. These are terrible choices, but they're still choices. And as long as we have choices, we have hope. As long as we can choose, we remain human. As long as we resist, the hunger doesn't win completely. Shadow Valley is still there, waiting in the heart of the Appalachians. The Wendigo spirit still calls to those who carry the bloodline. People still disappear in those mountains, some by accident, some by design. The cycle continues, as it has for longer than anyone remembers. But so does the resistance. In Cherokee medicine, women teaching the old protections. In rangers like Harlan keeping watch at the forest's edge. In people like me, fighting a daily battle against our own cursed blood. We are not many, but we are enough. Enough to hold the darkness at bay. Enough to warn others. Enough to ensure that the hunger doesn't spread unchecked. The Wendigo is real. It lives in the space between human and animal, between survival and morality, between the world we know and the one we fear. It is the price of choosing to live when death would be kinder. It is the monster we all carry the potential to become. But potential is not destiny. Bloodline is not fate. The hunger is not inevitable. We can choose. We must choose. Every day, every hour, every moment, to remain human, to resist the call, to die ourselves rather than live as something else. This is my story. This is my warning. This is my promise. The Wendigo will not claim another crow. The bloodline ends with me one way or another. The mountains can call all they want. I will not answer. I will not return. I will not become. And if I weaken, if the hunger grows too strong, I have made provisions. Fire and salt water and Cherokee prayers. An ending that ensures no new beginning. A death that prevents rebirth. Silas, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. But I saved others from what you would have become. And someone will save others from what I might become. That's all we can do for each other in the end. Kill the monsters we love before they fully wake. Set each other free with terrible mercy. The sun is setting now, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. Somewhere in the mountains, things that were once human are stirring, preparing for the hunt. Somewhere in Shadow Valley, the Wendigo spirit waits for new hosts. Somewhere in the genetic lottery of humanity, children are being born with the potential for transformation. But also somewhere, people are learning the truth. Learning to recognize the signs. Learning the protections and prayers. Learning that monsters are real but don't have to win. We are the thin line. We are the ones who know. We are the infected who choose not to spread the infection. We are the cursed who refuse to pass on the curse. We are human, barely, but still human, still choosing, still fighting, until we can't anymore. And then, fire, always fire. The only mercy left, the only kindness we can offer, the only way to ensure the hunger dies with us. The forest has many secrets, many hungers, many horrors, but it also has guardians, even broken ones like me. We stand watch at the edges of the darkness. We hold the line as long as we can. We keep the monsters at bay, especially the ones that wear our faces, speak with our voices, hunt with our memories, especially those, because those are the most dangerous. The ones that remember being human, the ones that can mimic humanity well enough to hunt effectively, the ones that know exactly how to break others the way they were broken. I think about Silas every day, not the thing he was becoming in that cave, but the brother who taught me to fish, who stayed up with me when I had nightmares, who carved our initials into an old oak tree that probably still stands somewhere in those cursed mountains. I think about who he was before the hunger called him, before the forest claimed him, before he became something that needed to be burned. That's how I want to remember him. That's how I need to remember him. As human, as my brother, as someone who loved and was loved. Not as the monster he almost became, not as the thing with antlers and too many teeth, not as the hunger wearing his face. The medicine woman says this is important, remembering the human beneath the monster. She says it's what keeps us grounded, what prevents us from either giving in completely or losing ourselves in the fight. We have to remember that the Wendigo were people once, people who made a terrible choice, but people nonetheless. People with families and dreams and favorite songs. People who probably fought the hunger as long as they could before it won. People who deserve to be mourned even as they must be destroyed. This is the burden of those who know the truth. We must be willing to kill what we love. We must be willing to burn the infected to save the healthy. We must be willing to be burned ourselves when our time comes. It's a terrible arithmetic, but it's the only math that works. One infected allowed to transform can create dozens more. One Wendigo fully realized can hunt for centuries. One moment of weakness, of choosing survival over humanity, can doom generations. So, we hold the line. We take our bitter medicine. We speak our prayers. We resist the call of the mountains and the whisper of the hunger. We document what we know for those who come after. We prepare for our own endings, making them as quick and complete as possible. We save others from what we might become. And sometimes, on the good days, that feels like enough, like meaning, like purpose, like a form of love. Twisted and terrible but real. The love that says I will die before I let this spread. The love that says I will burn before I hunt you. The love that says the hunger ends with me. Night is falling now. The time when the barriers thin, when the forest speaks loudest, when the hunger grows strongest. I can feel it stirring in my blood, that ancient curse, that genetic time bomb. I can hear Shadow Valley calling, promising an end to the constant struggle. I can see Silas in my mind's eye, not as he was, but as he might have been if the transformation had completed. Powerful, free, no longer fighting what he'd become. It would be so easy to give in, to stop taking the bitter tea, to stop saying the prayers, to answer the mountain's call and let the hunger guide me home, to become what my blood insists I already am. So easy. But easy isn't right. Easy isn't human. Easy isn't love. So I choose the hard path again, as I have every day since I burned my brother and ran from those mountains. I choose to remain Nathaniel Crow, brother of Silas, carrier of a curse, fighter of a hunger that will never fully go away. I choose to document and warn and resist. I choose to be ready for my own burning when the time comes. I choose to love humanity more than my own survival. I choose fire over transformation, ending over becoming, death over the kind of life the Wendigo offers. These are my choices, small and daily and exhausting, but mine. And as long as I can choose, I am not lost. As long as I can choose, Silas's death meant something. As long as I can choose, the hunger doesn't win. Tomorrow will bring the same choices. And the day after, and the day after that, until I can't choose anymore, until the hunger wins or I win, until fire or transformation, until ending or becoming, until someone saves me the way I saved Silas, with flame and grief and terrible necessity. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I resist. Tonight, I remember. Tonight, I stay human. Tonight, the mountains call, but I don't answer. Tonight, the hunger gnaws but doesn't feed. Tonight, Silas sleeps quiet in my memory, free from what he was becoming. Tonight, I hold the line. And that's enough. For tonight, that's enough. The Wendigo is patient, but so am I. The curse is strong, but my choice is stronger. The mountains are calling, but I'm not listening. Not tonight, not yet. Maybe not ever, if I'm strong enough, if the medicine works, if the prayers hold. Maybe I'll be the exception. The one who carries the curse to the grave without passing it on. Maybe I'll break the chain that stretches back through generations of crows. Maybe the hunger ends with me, or maybe not. Maybe tomorrow or next week or next year, I'll weaken. Maybe the 7th year will be too much. Maybe I'll wake up in Shadow Valley with antlers growing from my skull and a taste for flesh. Maybe someone will have to burn me the way I burned Silas. Maybe I'll become another cautionary tale, another warning, another name on the list of the lost. But not tonight. Tonight, I'm still Nathaniel. Tonight, I'm still choosing. Tonight, I'm still human. And in this fight against an ancient curse, in this resistance against genetic destiny, in this daily battle against becoming a monster, tonight is all we have. Tonight is all we need. Tonight is enough. The forest keeps its secrets and its hungers, but it doesn't get to keep me. Not tonight, not while I can still choose, not while I still remember what it means to be human, to love, to sacrifice, to resist.